He was born with nothing, no throne waiting quietly for him, no empire drawn on any map, no certainty even that he would live to see 30. By the time he was 25, he had broken the greatest empire the world had ever known in a single afternoon. By 30, he had marched further than any Greek before him, past the edges of every map his tutors had ever shown him, into lands whose names the Greeks had not yet learned to spell. He would never lose a battle, not one, not ever. And he would be dead before he turned 33, in a foreign city far from home, with an empire so vast that even he, the man who built it, could not say who should hold it once he was gone. Tonight, his story whispers you to sleep. Good evening, sleepy soul. Welcome home to Grand Age Power, your quiet corner for history's most powerful lives, told gently, told slowly, told just for you. New here? Welcome. Returning? Always a genuine pleasure to have you back. Make yourself comfortable. Lights low. Let the day fall away. Tonight we travel to the dusty hills of ancient Macedon, to a boy who tamed a horse no man could ride, who studied under the greatest mind of his age, and who would grow into the young king the world came to know as Alexander the Great. We will walk beside him through burning cities and quiet river camps, through victories that reshaped continents and losses that reshaped him. We will sit with him in his final, fevered nights in Babylon and ask, gently, what it costs a man to conquer the entire known world. This is his complete story, told with all the weight and wonder it deserves. Before we begin, a like helps other sleepy souls find their way here. Subscribe so you never miss another story. And tell me in the comments, do you think Alexander conquered the world out of ambition, or was he running from something he could never quite outpace? Blankets close, breath slow. Let's begin. In the summer of 356 BC, in the Macedonian capital of Pella, a son was born to King Philip II and his wife Olympias. Historians believe the boy arrived on the 6th day of the month the Macedonians called Lous, and legend, which was never far from this family, insisted that on that very night, far away in the city of Ephesus, the great temple of Artemis burned to the ground. The goddess, people whispered, had been too busy attending the birth of a boy who would one day outshine her to protect her own temple from the flames. It was, of course, only a story, but it was the kind of story this family told about itself from the very beginning, and the kind of story the world would keep telling about the boy for the next 2,000 years. His mother, Olympias, was a princess of Epirus, fierce and devout, a woman who practiced the mystery rites of Dionysus and who let it be known, in ways both subtle and not, that she believed her son's true father was not a king at all, but a god. Some ancient writers claim she told Alexander this herself when he was still young. Whether she believed it or simply understood its usefulness, we cannot know for certain. But the boy grew up in a household where greatness was not aspiration. It was expectation. His father, Philip II, was no myth. He was something rarer, a self-made king who had transformed a fractured kingdom of hill tribes and quarreling nobles into the most feared military power in the Greek world. Philip had spent years as a hostage in Thebes in his youth, and he had watched carefully. He had studied the Theban general Epaminondas and the tactics that had briefly made Thebes supreme in Greece. When Philip returned home to rule, he brought those lessons with him and improved on them. He reorganized the Macedonian army around a new weapon, the sarissa, a spear nearly 18 feet long, wielded by soldiers marching in a tight formation called the phalanx. He drilled his men relentlessly. He paid them, fed them, and made soldiering itself a profession rather than a seasonal duty. By the time his son was old enough to understand what a kingdom was, Philip had already made Macedon the most dangerous army in the Greek-speaking world. This was the house Alexander was born into, a father who built armies, and a mother who believed her son was born of Olympus itself. He was, by every surviving account, a strange and intense child. Not physically imposing, ancient sources describe him as of only middling height, fair-skinned, with one eye said to be blue and the other faintly darker, a detail later writers found endlessly fascinating. What struck people who met him, even as a boy, was not his body, but his stillness. A restlessness held tightly in check. A mind that seemed to be somewhere else entirely, chasing something the rest of the room could not see. There is a story, one of the most famous in the whole of his childhood, that when Alexander was about 12 years old, a horse trader brought a magnificent animal to Philip's court. The horse was enormous, black with a white star on its forehead, and utterly wild. It reared at every hand that reached for it. It threw every rider who tried to mount it. Philip, watching his men fail one after another, ordered the horse taken away, a beautiful animal, but useless if no one could ride it. Alexander, watching from the side, said that it was a shame to lose such a horse simply because no one had the skill to manage it. Philip, amused or irritated, accounts differ, asked his son if he thought he could do better, and if he failed, would he pay the price of the horse himself? Alexander agreed. He had noticed something the grown men had missed. The horse was not frightened of the crowd, or the noise, or the whip. It was frightened of its own shadow, stretching and twisting on the ground in front of it. Alexander turned the animal to face the sun, so its shadow fell behind it, where it could not see it. Then, calmly, he stroked its neck, spoke to it low and steady, and swung himself onto its back. The horse ran. Alexander let it run, guiding it gently rather than fighting it, until it settled beneath him, breathing hard but calm. When he rode back to where his father stood, the court was silent. Philip, it is said, wept, and told his son that Macedon was too small a kingdom for him. He would need to find a larger one. The horse's name was Bucephalus. Alexander would ride him for the next 20 years, across mountains and rivers and deserts no Macedonian had ever crossed, until the animal was old and grey and died on the banks of a river in India, and Alexander, grieving, would found a city there and name it in his honour. But that was still 2 decades away. For now, he was simply a boy who had tamed a horse no man could ride, and a father who had begun to understand what kind of son he had raised. Philip understood something else too, that raw brilliance needed shaping. A wild horse could be tamed by instinct. A mind like Alexander's needed education equal to its hunger. So Philip did something almost unthinkable for a king of a kingdom still considered half barbarian by the sophisticated cities of southern Greece. He sent for the finest philosopher in the Greek world to come and personally tutor his son. The philosopher's name was Aristotle. Aristotle had studied for 20 years at Plato's Academy in Athens. He was, by the time Philip summoned him, already one of the most formidable minds of his age, a student of logic, biology, ethics, politics, poetry, and the natural world in all its forms. Philip offered him a generous price for his trouble, in exchange for tutoring the prince. Philip would rebuild Aristotle's hometown of Stagira, which Macedonian forces had destroyed years earlier, and repopulate it with its exiled citizens. Aristotle accepted. For roughly 3 years, in a quiet retreat called Mieza, away from the noise and politics of the Macedonian court, Aristotle taught Alexander and a small circle of noble companions his age, boys who would later become the generals, governors, and closest friends of his empire. He taught them philosophy, medicine, science, rhetoric, and above all, he gave Alexander something that would follow him for the rest of his life: an annotated copy of Homer's Iliad. which Alexander is said to have kept beneath his pillow every night of his campaigns alongside a dagger, as though the poem itself needed guarding. It is difficult, from the distance of more than 2,000 years, to overstate what the Iliad meant to Alexander. He did not read it as literature. He read it as a mirror and a challenge. Achilles, swift, glorious, doomed to a short life and eternal fame rather than a long life and quiet obscurity, became the model against which Alexander measured every choice he would ever make. Historians believe that when Alexander later crossed into Asia to begin his war against Persia, one of his first acts was to visit the site of ancient Troy and lay a wreath at what was said to be the tomb of Achilles, running a ritual foot race naked around it in the old Greek fashion, before declaring that Achilles had been fortunate to have found in his own lifetime a poet like Homer to make his brief life immortal. Alexander wanted the same fortune. He would spend the rest of his life trying to earn it. But before there was an empire to conquer, there was a kingdom to inherit, and a father whose shadow was, for a time, still far larger than his own. Philip's court was not a gentle place. It was full of ambitious men, rival wives, and a king who, brilliant as he was, drank hard and married often for political advantage. Olympias, proud and unyielding, did not share her husband's bed with grace, and the tension between them shaped the atmosphere Alexander grew up in. A boy watching his parents circle each other warily, each one in different ways, shaping him into a weapon aimed at greatness. The lessons at Mieza went far beyond poetry. Aristotle, whose curiosity ranged across nearly every field of knowledge available to the ancient world, taught his young students the principles of logic and rhetoric, the beginnings of what we would now call biology and zoology, the geography of the known world as the Greeks understood it, and the political theory that would later fill his great treatise on the workings of cities and constitutions. Ancient sources suggest Alexander developed, under this tutelage, a genuine and lasting fascination with the natural world, a curiosity that would express itself years later deep in his Asian campaigns, in the collections of unfamiliar plants and animals he sent back to Aristotle in Greece, specimens gathered from lands no Greek scholar had ever had the opportunity to study firsthand. Whatever else the conquest of Asia would become, a war, an empire, an obsession, it began in some quiet corner of Alexander's mind, as an extension of a classroom in the Macedonian hills, a chance to finally see, with his own eyes, the places his tutor could previously only describe second-hand. It was here at Mieza, too, that the bonds between Alexander and his closest companions were forged in something more lasting than shared lessons. Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, and the other noble sons who studied alongside their prince were not merely classmates. They were being quietly, deliberately shaped into the leadership core of whatever kingdom, whatever empire Alexander would one day command. Philip understood, as thoroughly as he understood the mechanics of the sarissa and the phalanx, that an army is only as strong as the loyalty between its commanders, and that loyalty built in boyhood, tested through years of shared study and shared hardship, tends to run deeper and prove more durable than loyalty bought with gold or rank alone. It was an investment that would pay extraordinary dividends in the years ahead, and one that would make the eventual fractures within that same circle of companions, when they finally came, all the more painful for how deep the original bonds had run. At 16, Alexander received his first true taste of power. Philip left Macedon to campaign against the city of Byzantium, and rather than leave the kingdom in the hands of a regent unrelated to his line, he left it in the hands of his teenage son. It was, on its face, an enormous risk. It was also, perhaps, a test. Alexander did not waste it. While his father was away, a Thracian tribe called the Maedi rose in rebellion along the kingdom's northern border. The 16-year-old prince gathered a force, marched north, crushed the rebellion, drove the Maedi from their territory, and founded a new city on the site, populating it with Greek settlers and naming it, with the confidence of a boy who had already begun to think in terms of legacy. Alexandropolis, Alexander's city. It was the first city he ever founded. It would not be the last. Before his life was over, he would found, or historians believe he founded, since some claims are almost certainly later exaggeration, somewhere between 12 and 20 cities across 3 continents, many of them still bearing some form of his name to this day. 2 years later, at 18, Alexander received his first true test on the battlefield that mattered most, not against a border tribe, but against the combined might of southern Greece itself. By 338 BC, Philip's growing power had alarmed the great southern city-states, above all Athens and Thebes, who had spent a generation distrusting and underestimating the barbarian kingdom to their north. They finally set aside their old rivalries and formed a coalition army to stop Philip before Macedon swallowed all of Greece. The two forces met near the town of Chaeronea, in Boeotia, in a battle that would decide in a single afternoon whether Greece would remain a patchwork of proud, quarrelling city-states or become the foundation stone of something larger. Philip commanded the right wing of the Macedonian army himself. He gave his 18-year-old son command of the left wing, and with it, command of the elite companion cavalry, the finest heavy cavalry force in the Greek world. Opposite Alexander stood the sacred band of Thebes, 300 men, organized according to tradition, into 150 pairs of lovers and companions, bound to one another by intimate loyalty as much as military discipline. They had never been defeated. For nearly 40 years, no army had broken their line. Picture the moment as it must have looked from inside it, the dust of thousands of marching feet hanging thick in the summer air, the Macedonian phalanx grinding forward on the right in tight, disciplined ranks, while, on the left, Alexander watched the Theban line with an 18-year-old's mixture of terror and total focus, waiting for the gap that his father's careful battle plan had promised would eventually appear. When it did, there was no hesitation. No council of officers convened to weigh the risk. He simply went, driving his horse forward at the head of the companion cavalry, into a formation of professional soldiers who had never once, in nearly 4 decades, broken and run from any enemy they had faced. Alexander broke it that day. Details of the exact maneuver are debated by historians even now, but the outcome is not. As Philip's phalanx drew the Athenian line forward and then, in a controlled feint, pulled back, gaps opened in the coalition's formation. Alexander, watching from the left, saw the opening before anyone gave the order and drove his cavalry straight into it, smashing into the Theban line and, according to ancient sources, personally leading the charge that finally broke the previously unbeatable sacred band. Nearly all 300 of them died where they stood, refusing, even in defeat, to break formation and run. The Battle of Chaeronea ended Greek independence as the city-states had known it. Philip was now, in practice, the master of Greece, and his 18-year-old son had just proven, in the bloodiest and most decisive way possible, that he was not merely a prince waiting for a throne. He was already, in every way that mattered on a battlefield, a commander. Perhaps, in the quiet after that battle, walking among the dead of the sacred band who had chosen annihilation over retreat, Alexander understood something that would define the rest of his life. Glory was not simply won. It was paid for, in blood, in loyalty, in men who followed a leader they trusted all the way to their own deaths without hesitation. He had just learned he could inspire that kind of following. He was 18 years old. He did not yet have a kingdom of his own. But he had already begun to understand the terrible, addictive shape of power, how it is built, what it costs, and how far a man might go once he has tasted what it feels like to be followed without question into the very center of the storm. Within 2 years, his father would be dead, murdered by an assassin's blade at his own daughter's wedding feast, and the boy who had tamed an unrideable horse and broken an unbeatable line of soldiers would become, at the age of 20, king of Macedon. The story of his rise had only just begun. It is worth pausing here, before the war against Persia truly begins, to understand exactly what kind of weapon Philip had placed in his son's hands, because without it, none of what followed would have been possible. The Macedonian phalanx that Philip built was unlike anything the southern Greek city-states had ever fielded. Where a traditional Greek hoplite carried a spear perhaps 7 or 8 feet long, the Macedonian sarissa stretched nearly 18 feet, requiring both hands to wield and forcing soldiers to carry a smaller shield strapped to the forearm rather than gripped in the hand. Arranged in tight ranks, 5 or 6 spear points deep, a Macedonian phalanx presented an enemy with an advancing wall of iron that no ordinary infantry line could hope to break through directly. But the phalanx alone, Philip understood, was not enough. It was slow, and it was vulnerable on its flanks. What made the Macedonian army truly revolutionary was how Philip combined it with the companion cavalry. Heavy horsemen, drawn from Macedon's noble families, trained to strike at exactly the moment and exactly the place where an enemy line began to waver. It was, in essence, a hammer and an anvil. The phalanx held an enemy in place, absorbed their charge, ground down their will to keep fighting. And then, when a gap opened, as gaps always eventually opened, under that relentless pressure, the cavalry drove through it like a blade, finding the one soft place in an otherwise sealed door. Alexander did not invent this system, but he understood it more completely and used it more boldly than perhaps any commander in history before or since. Every one of his great victories, Chaeronea, the Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, followed some variation of the same essential pattern: hold, wait, watch for the gap, and then throw everything into the gap the instant it appeared, personally, at the front, at the very moment of maximum danger. It was, his critics would say in later years, a reckless way for a king to fight, risking the entire future of his kingdom and his empire on his own survival in the front rank of every major battle he ever fought. It was also, his admirers would counter, exactly why his soldiers followed him as far as they did, through terrain and hardship that might have broken the loyalty of an army led by a more cautious king. A soldier who watches his commander bleed in the same mud he bleeds in follows that commander somewhere. A soldier who only receives orders from a safe hilltop never would. Around Alexander, even in these earliest years, had gathered a circle of companions who would remain with him, some of them, at least, for the rest of his extraordinary life. There was Hephaestion, closest of all, a boy Alexander had grown up alongside since childhood, whom later ancient writers would compare, again and again, to Patroclus, beside Alexander's own self-cast Achilles. There was Ptolemy, sharp and ambitious, who would one day become Pharaoh of Egypt in his own right, and write one of the most detailed accounts of Alexander's campaigns to survive from antiquity. There was Perdiccas, Craterus, Seleucus, names that meant little to the world yet, young Macedonian nobles trained alongside their prince at Mieza under Aristotle's patient instruction, who would each, in the chaos that followed Alexander's eventual death, carve out kingdoms of their own from the empire they had helped him build. None of them, in these early years, could have imagined quite how far their prince intended to take them. Perhaps not even Alexander himself fully understood it yet. He was, at 18, a gifted young commander who had just helped his father conquer Greece. The world beyond the Hellespont, Persia, Egypt, the deserts of Central Asia, the rivers of India, still existed for him largely, as it did for every other educated Greek of his generation, as a distant, half-mythical backdrop for stories, not yet a real place he expected to walk through himself, spear in hand, at the head of the finest army the Greek world had ever produced. That was about to change. It is worth understanding, too, the family drama simmering beneath the surface of Philip's court in the final year of his life, because it shaped the circumstances of his death and the earliest, most dangerous days of Alexander's reign more directly than any external threat from Greece or Persia. Philip had married many times over the course of his reign, a common practice for Macedonian kings, who used marriage alliances to secure the loyalty of powerful families and neighboring territories, rather than treating royal marriage primarily as a matter of romantic partnership. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was neither his first wife nor his last, and the competition among Philip's various wives and their children for influence and eventual succession created a court atmosphere thick with rivalry and suspicion. The situation grew considerably more dangerous for Alexander's position when Philip, late in his reign, married a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, notably, unlike Olympias, a woman of pure Macedonian blood rather than a foreign princess from Epirus, a distinction that mattered enormously to certain factions at court who had never fully embraced Olympias or her half-Epirote son as truly, uncomplicatedly Macedonian. At the wedding feast celebrating this new marriage, an incident occurred that ancient sources treat as a genuine turning point in the relationship between Philip and his son. Cleopatra Eurydice's uncle, a nobleman named Attalus, reportedly raised a toast expressing hope that the marriage would soon produce a legitimate Macedonian heir to the throne, a barely veiled insult toward Alexander. Questioning his own legitimacy as heir despite being Philip's son by Olympias, Alexander, enraged, hurled a cup at Attalus. Philip, drunk and equally enraged, drew his sword and moved toward his own son, only to stumble and fall before reaching him, a moment ancient writers seized upon with obvious relish, Alexander reportedly remarking, with cold precision, that here was a man who intended to cross from Europe into Asia to conquer an empire, and who could not even cross safely from one couch to another. The rift that followed was serious enough that Alexander and his mother left Macedon entirely for a period, Olympias returning to her family in Epirus, Alexander eventually going into a form of voluntary exile among the Illyrians, a people the Macedonians had fought against for generations. It was a genuine crisis in the royal family, only gradually and incompletely healed in the months before Philip's assassination, which is precisely why the wedding feast where Philip died, celebrating the marriage of Alexander's sister to the king of Epirus, carried such fraught undertones. It was meant, in part, as a moment of reconciliation and unified celebration for a royal family that had spent the previous year publicly, humiliatingly fractured. Instead, it became the setting for Philip's murder, and the beginning of a reign that would carry Alexander further from Macedon in every sense than his father could ever have imagined. In October of 336 BC, King Philip II walked into the theatre at Aegae, the old religious capital of Macedon, to celebrate the wedding of his daughter. He had just secured his position as the unchallenged master of Greece. He had already begun planning something even larger, an invasion of the Persian Empire, the vast, wealthy power that had loomed over the Greek world for generations, ever since Persian armies had twice tried and failed to conquer Greece a century and a half earlier. Philip meant to be the one to finally turn the tables. He meant to lead the invasion himself. He never got the chance. As he entered the theatre, ahead of his bodyguards, a young nobleman named Pausanias, a member of his own royal guard, said to be nursing a private grievance against the king, stepped forward and drove a dagger into Philip's chest. Philip died almost instantly. His assassin was killed moments later while trying to flee. Historians have argued for over 2,000 years about who, if anyone, stood behind Pausanias. Some ancient sources whisper that Olympias herself may have had a hand in it, furious over Philip's recent marriage to a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, which threatened to push Olympias and her son aside in the succession. Others suggest Persian gold might have paid for the blade, eager to see Macedon's dangerous new king removed before he could invade. The truth has never been established, and likely never will be. What is certain is simply this: within moments of Philip's death, the throne of Macedon stood empty, and every ambitious rival in the kingdom understood that the next few hours would decide who filled it. Alexander was 20 years old. He moved immediately, and he moved without hesitation. With the backing of his father's most senior general, Antipater, and the loyalty of the army that had watched him fight at Cheronea, Alexander presented himself to the Macedonian nobility and soldiers as king before any rival could organize an alternative. The army, which under Macedonian tradition held real power in confirming a new ruler, acclaimed him, but acclamation was only the beginning. A new king in the ancient world was rarely safe until every plausible rival was gone, and Alexander, whatever tenderness his later admirers might wish to read into him, understood this with cold clarity from his very first days on the throne. Potential rivals within the royal family were eliminated, cousins with claims to the throne, and at least one infant child of Philip's final marriage did not survive Alexander's first months as king. Some accounts suggest Olympias herself carried out or ordered some of these killings, taking a mother's brutal revenge for the humiliation Philip's final marriage had caused her. Alexander, for his part, is said to have been troubled by the extremity of some of what was done in his name, though he did little to stop it. Power, even for an 18-year-old who had once wept with his father over a tamed horse, had already begun to demand its price. Beyond Macedon's borders, the news of Philip's death travelled fast, and it travelled like an invitation. Greek cities that had chafed under Macedonian dominance since Cheronea saw an opportunity. Thebes, the city whose sacred band Alexander himself had broken 2 years earlier, rose in open revolt, along with murmurs of rebellion in Athens and stirrings among the northern tribes who had never fully accepted Macedonian rule. Alexander's response revealed, for the first time on the largest possible stage, the terrifying speed that would become the signature of his entire career. Before his enemies believed he could possibly arrive, he was already there. He marched south through Thessaly so quickly that the Thessalians, stunned to find a Macedonian army already among them, submitted without a fight. He continued into central Greece, where the news of his impossible speed alone convinced most of the wavering cities to abandon any thought of rebellion. Within weeks, he had been confirmed by the assembled Greek states as the leader of the very alliance his father had built, the League of Corinth, inheriting, along with the title, his father's planned war against Persia. Then he turned north to deal with the tribes along Macedon's frontier, who had also sensed weakness in a young, untested king. In a series of hard, fast campaigns across the Balkans, Alexander crushed the Triballians and the Getae, pushing Macedonian authority all the way to the Danube River and demonstrating to every watching eye that the son was, if anything, an even more relentless commander than the father had been. It was while he was occupied in the north, far from Greece, that a false rumour reached the city of Thebes. Alexander, the rumour claimed, was dead, killed in the fighting along the Danube. Thebes rose again, and this time in open, undisguised rebellion, laying siege to the small Macedonian garrison still holding the city's citadel. Alexander was not dead. And when word reached him of what Thebes had done, he turned his army around and marched south with a speed that seemed, to those who witnessed it, almost supernatural. 13 days later, a distance that should have taken far longer, his army stood outside the walls of Thebes. What happened next remains, even now, one of the most debated and difficult moments of his entire life. Alexander offered the city terms. He gave the Thebans an opportunity to surrender the men responsible for the rebellion, to accept Macedonian authority once more, and to end the confrontation without further bloodshed. The city refused. Whether out of genuine defiance, desperation, or simply disbelief that the young king could truly be as ruthless as his reputation suggested, the Thebans chose to fight rather than submit. The battle that followed was brutal and brief. Thebes' walls fell. Macedonian and allied Greek troops, some of them, it is said, from cities that held old grudges against Theban dominance, poured into the city. What followed was a massacre. Historians believe as many as 6,000 Thebans were killed in the fighting and the sack that followed, and the survivors, some 30,000 men, women, and children, were sold into slavery. Alexander then ordered something that shocked the Greek world far more than the killing itself: the near total destruction of the city. Every building was torn down, save for the temples of the gods and the house that had once belonged to the poet Pindar, spared, according to tradition, out of respect for great poetry even amid the ruin of everything else. Thebes, one of the oldest and most storied cities in Greece, a city whose name appeared throughout Homer and Greek myth, effectively ceased to exist. Perhaps, in the smoking silence after the city fell, Alexander understood the message he had just sent to every city in Greece and every rival who might still be watching for weakness. He was not his father, patient and diplomatic, willing to negotiate and compromise for decades to build his power slowly. He was something else, a young man in a hurry who intended to prove. In his first year on the throne, that hesitation to submit to him carried a cost too terrible to risk. The message landed. No Greek city rose against him again for the rest of his life. With Greece pacified through terror as much as loyalty and the northern frontier secured, Alexander turned, finally, to the war his father had planned and never lived to fight: the invasion of the Persian Empire. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow straits separating Europe from Asia, at the head of an army of roughly 40,000 men, a combined force of Macedonians and troops drawn from across the League of Corinth. He left Antipater behind in Macedon to govern in his absence, along with a substantial portion of his forces to guard against any renewed unrest in Greece while he was gone. According to ancient tradition, as his ship approached the Asian shore, Alexander himself threw a spear from the deck, letting it land in the sand, and declared that he was taking Asia as spear-won territory, a gift from the gods to the man brave enough to seize it. Whatever the literal truth of the gesture, it captures precisely how Alexander understood what he was about to do. This was not merely a military campaign. It was, in his mind, something closer to destiny being claimed. His first stop on Asian soil was Troy. It is one of the most quietly moving details of his entire story, that before he fought a single Persian soldier, before he claimed a single city or won a single battle in his war against the greatest empire in the world, Alexander went first to pay tribute to a war fought, by legend, over 1,000 years earlier. He visited the site, believed to be ancient Troy, made sacrifices to Athena, and, according to several ancient sources, ran naked around what was said to be the tomb of Achilles in a traditional Greek ritual of mourning and honor, while his closest companion, Hephaestion, ran a similar circuit around the tomb believed to belong to Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion. Historians believe Alexander also took, from a temple at Troy, a set of ancient arms said to date back to the Trojan War itself, and had them carried before him for the rest of his campaigns as a kind of talisman, a physical thread connecting his war to the one that had shaped his imagination since boyhood. Perhaps, standing at Troy, Alexander felt something no army, no throne, no conquest could quite give him, the sense of stepping directly into the story he had read beneath his pillow every night since he was a child. He had crossed into Asia. Now he needed his own Iliad, his own moment where legend and reality would meet on the battlefield and become indistinguishable from one another. He did not have to wait long. Word reached the Persian satraps, the regional governors who administered the empire's western territories, that a Macedonian army had crossed into Asia. They gathered their forces, a combined army of Persian cavalry, Greek mercenaries fighting for Persian pay, and local levies, and positioned themselves along the eastern bank of a river called the Granicus, in what is now northwestern Turkey, blocking Alexander's path inland. The Battle of the Granicus River, fought in May of 334 BC, was Alexander's first true test against the empire he had come to conquer, and it very nearly ended his story before it had properly begun. The Persian cavalry held the high ground on the far bank, a strong defensive position that made any crossing a dangerous, exposed maneuver. Alexander's more senior general, Parmenion, reportedly urged caution. Wait, camp for the night, cross in the morning when the Persians might be less prepared for an immediate assault. Alexander, characteristically, refused to wait. He led the cavalry charge himself, driving directly into the teeth of the Persian defense, crossing the river under fire and smashing into the Persian line at its strongest point rather than looking for a softer target. It was, by any conventional military logic, a reckless decision. It very nearly killed him. In the chaos of close combat on the riverbank, a Persian nobleman named Spithridates swung his sword at Alexander's exposed head from behind, a blow that would almost certainly have killed him had one of his companions, a Macedonian officer named Cletus, not intervened at the last possible instant, severing the attacker's arm before the blow could land. It was a debt Alexander would remember for the rest of his life, and one that would return, years later, with a devastating irony neither man could have imagined on that riverbank. The battle itself, once the initial crossing succeeded, turned quickly in Alexander's favour. The Persian cavalry broke and fled. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, cut off and surrounded, were largely destroyed. Alexander, still furious that Greeks would take Persian money to fight against a pan-Hellenic invasion, showed them little mercy, in sharp contrast to the relative generosity he sometimes extended to defeated Persian nobility. The victory at Granicus opened the whole of Western Asia Minor to him, city after city, many of them Greek settlements that had lived under Persian rule for generations, opened their gates and welcomed Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He moved down the coast, securing the region careful, where he could afford to be, to present himself not simply as an invader, but as the leader of a great Hellenic crusade of liberation against the old Persian enemy that had once tried to burn Athens to the ground. It was in this same period, marching inland through the region of Phrygia, that Alexander encountered one of the strangest and most enduring legends of his entire career. A legend that, whether entirely true or partly embellished by later storytellers eager to find omens everywhere in his life, perfectly captures the particular shape of his genius. Not every city surrendered so willingly. At Miletus, a fortified port city that initially wavered between submission and resistance while waiting to see whether a Persian relief fleet might arrive to save it, Alexander undertook one of his earliest true sieges, blockading the harbour to prevent Persian ships from landing reinforcements and pressing the assault until the city's defences collapsed. It was here, historians believe, that Alexander made a decision with consequences far beyond the single city in front of him. Recognizing that his own fleet was small and outmatched by the far larger Persian navy still controlling the eastern Mediterranean, he chose to disband most of his own ships rather than risk them in open battle, gambling instead that he could defeat Persian naval power indirectly by capturing every port and harbour along the coast the Persian fleet depended on for supply and shelter, leaving their ships nowhere left to safely dock. It was a daring strategic wager, trading control of the sea for a relentless conquest of the land that bordered it. And it would shape nearly 2 years of subsequent campaigning along the coast. At Halicarnassus, further south, Alexander faced his most stubborn resistance yet in Asia Minor. The city was defended by a combined force of Persian troops and Greek mercenaries under the command of a capable Persian general named Memnon of Rhodes. One of the few commanders in Persian service whose tactical skill genuinely worried Alexander's own officers. The siege dragged on for weeks, marked by brutal fighting around the city's walls, breached sections desperately refortified overnight, and repeated sorties by the defenders that inflicted real losses on the besieging Macedonians. In the end, Memnon, recognizing the city could not hold indefinitely, made the difficult decision to evacuate his remaining forces by sea under cover of darkness, setting fire to parts of the city as he withdrew rather than allow it to fall to Alexander fully intact. Alexander took what remained of Halicarnassus, installed a friendly local ruler, Ada, a Carian queen who had been driven from her own throne years earlier and who reportedly came to regard Alexander with something close to maternal affection, formally adopting him as her son according to local custom, and pressed on down the coast, methodically closing off harbour after harbour to the Persian fleet, exactly as his gamble at Miletus had required. It was slow, grinding, unglamorous work compared to the drama of a pitched battle like the Granicus, but it was, in its own way, just as essential to everything that followed. By the time Alexander turned inland, away from the coast and toward the interior of Asia Minor, the Persian navy found itself with fewer and fewer places along the entire eastern Mediterranean where it could safely resupply, a slow strangulation that would only be completed years later with the fall of Tyre. In the city of Gordium stood an ancient wagon, its yoke bound to its pole by an intricate knot of cornel bark, tied so tightly and so cleverly that no one could find where it began or ended. According to local legend, an oracle had declared that whoever succeeded in untying the Gordian knot was destined to become the ruler of all Asia. Generations of hopeful men had tried and failed. Alexander examined the knot. Accounts differ as to exactly what happened next. Some say he studied it carefully and found a hidden peg that, once removed, allowed the knot to loosen. Others, in the version that has echoed down through history ever since, say he simply drew his sword and cut the knot in half with a single stroke, declaring that it did not matter how a knot was undone, only that it was undone. Whether by clever insight or decisive violence, and perhaps it does not matter which, since both were equally characteristic of him, Alexander walked away from Gordium having fulfilled the prophecy in the eyes of everyone watching. He was destined, the story now insisted, to rule all of Asia. He had at this point defeated a single Persian army in a single battle at the empire's western edge. The empire itself, its full might, its endless resources, and its great king, Darius III, still lay far ahead of him, largely untouched. But increasingly, wherever Alexander went, the line between the man and the myth was beginning to blur, not only in the minds of the people who watched him pass, but, perhaps, in his own mind as well. Perhaps it is worth sitting, for a moment, in the particular texture of those early months in Asia Minor, not simply the battles, but the quieter work of empire building that ran alongside them. The work that rarely makes it into the shorter, more dramatic tellings of Alexander's story. As city after city along the Ionian coast opened its gates to him, Alexander faced a genuinely difficult political question, one that would recur in different forms for the rest of his life. How does a conqueror govern the people he has just conquered? Many of these Greek cities had lived for generations under Persian-appointed governments, some democratic in form, many controlled by local oligarchs or tyrants who owed their position to Persian favor. Alexander, presenting himself as a liberator restoring Greek freedom rather than simply replacing one foreign master with another, generally worked to install or restore democratic governments in these cities, a policy that was, in equal measure, genuine ideological conviction inherited from his Greek education and shrewd political calculation, since cities governed by grateful new democracies were far less likely to conspire with Persia to unseat him than cities still resentfully controlled by pro-Persian oligarchs. At the same time, Alexander showed, even this early in his campaign, an instinct that would define his entire approach to empire, a willingness to be flexible, even inconsistent, about the details of local governance, so long as the deeper loyalty to himself remained secure. In some cities, he restored full democracy. In others, where local circumstances made it more practical, he left existing structures largely intact, simply replacing Persian oversight with Macedonian oversight and moving on. He was building an empire at extraordinary speed, and he understood, with a pragmatism beyond his years, that perfect ideological consistency mattered far less than keeping his rear secure while he pressed forward into the Persian heartland. There was also, in these months, the slower, less glamorous work of logistics, the endless grinding necessity of feeding, paying, and supplying an army of tens of thousands of men and their accompanying animals as it marched further and further from its home supply lines. Alexander's father Philip had understood decades earlier that an army that could not feed itself could not fight, and he had built the Macedonian military machine around a level of logistical discipline that was, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely revolutionary. Soldiers trained to carry much of their own equipment, baggage trains kept deliberately lean, supply depots and secured coastal ports established methodically as the army advanced. It was unglamorous work, the kind that appears in no epic poem and inspires no ancient sculptor, and it is also, historians increasingly agree, one of the quiet. Underappreciated reasons Alexander's campaigns succeeded were a merely brilliant battlefield tactician, lacking this deeper logistical foundation, might well have starved in the field long before ever reaching Gaugamela. Perhaps, in the long dusty hours between one city's surrender and the next army's march, Alexander was already beginning to understand something that his years in Persia would teach him more and more completely. That conquering an empire and holding an empire were two entirely different arts, requiring two entirely different kinds of genius, and that he would need, before this was over, to become fluent in both. By the autumn of 333 BC, word of the young Macedonian king's victories had finally reached the ears of the man who mattered most. Darius III, great king of Persia, ruler of an empire that stretched from the shores of the Aegean to the mountains of Afghanistan and the banks of the Indus River. Darius had, until now, treated the invasion as a regional problem, something for his western satraps to manage. That confidence had died, along with his army at the Granicus. Now Darius gathered a force of staggering size, ancient sources likely exaggerating as ancient sources so often did with enemy numbers, claimed hundreds of thousands of men, and marched west himself to end the Macedonian threat, personally. The two armies finally met near the town of Issus, on a narrow coastal plain in what is now southeastern Turkey, hemmed in between mountains and the sea. It was, in a strange way, a fortunate battlefield for Alexander. Darius's vast numerical advantage, real or exaggerated, it scarcely mattered, counted for far less on a cramped strip of coastline than it would have on open ground, where the Persian cavalry could have used its full mobility to encircle the smaller Macedonian force. The Battle of Issus, fought in November of 333 BC, became one of the most important encounters not only of Alexander's career, but of ancient military history entirely. Alexander did what he had done at the Granicus, and what he would do again and again throughout his life. Rather than commanding cautiously from a safe distance, he personally led the decisive cavalry charge, driving his companion cavalry directly at the section of the Persian line closest to Darius himself. It was a calculated gamble, built on psychology as much as tactics. Persian command structure, unlike the more distributed leadership of the Macedonian army, depended heavily on the presence and visible authority of the great king. Threaten Darius directly, and the entire Persian line might waver, regardless of how the battle was going elsewhere on the field. The gamble worked. As Alexander's cavalry closed on his position, Darius, whether from genuine panic or a calculated decision that his own survival mattered more than the battle's outcome, fled the field, abandoning his chariot, his royal cloak, his bow, and, in the chaos of the retreat, his own family. There is a detail from that charge worth sitting with, quietly, for a moment. Ancient accounts describe the two kings, for one brief span of the battle, close enough to see each other clearly across the churning chaos of the field, Alexander driving forward through the press of soldiers and horses, Darius standing in his chariot above the battle, close enough, perhaps, that each man understood exactly who he was looking at. It was, historians believe, the only time in the entire war that the two rulers ever set eyes on one another. Neither would ever forget it. Darius fled a battle he might, on different ground, with steadier nerve, conceivably have won. Alexander, watching him go, understood in that instant that he had just broken something in his opponent that no army, however large, could ever fully repair, the belief, essential to any Persian king's authority, that the great king did not run. Once Darius fled, the vast Persian army, uncertain and leaderless, began to collapse. What had been a battle became a rout, and then, in the narrow terrain where escape routes were few, something closer to a slaughter. Historians believe the Persian casualties, especially among those trapped without an easy line of retreat, were catastrophic, far exceeding anything Alexander's own forces suffered that day. Among the abandoned camp Alexander captured after the battle was Darius's own family, his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statira, and his children, along with a vast treasure of Persian gold. What Alexander did next tells us perhaps more about him than any battlefield victory could. He did not humiliate them. He did not parade them as trophies or treat them with the casual cruelty that ancient conquerors so often reserved for the families of defeated kings. Instead, according to multiple ancient sources, Alexander visited the royal women personally, assured them they would be treated with the dignity befitting their rank, and allowed them to continue living according to royal Persian custom, with their own attendants and comforts, effectively as honoured captives rather than prisoners. Sisygambis, Darius's mother, is said to have come to regard Alexander with something approaching genuine affection over the following years, so much so that, according to later tradition, when news eventually reached her of Alexander's death, she withdrew from all food and light and died herself within days, unable to bear the loss. Perhaps this was calculated mercy, a young conqueror understanding that generosity toward a defeated enemy's family could pay dividends in the loyalty of a newly conquered population far more effectively than cruelty ever could. Perhaps it was something more genuine, a reflection of a young man raised by Aristotle to believe that true greatness required restraint as much as ambition. Very likely, it was both at once. Alexander was rarely a man of only one motive. The relationship between Alexander and Sisygambis deserves particular attention because it offers one of the clearest windows we have into the more generous, more surprising side of his character. Ancient sources describe an almost tender formality between them, Alexander visiting her regularly, seeking her counsel on matters of Persian custom and protocol, and treating her, by several accounts, with something closer to the respect a son owes a mother than the wary courtesy a conqueror typically extends to a defeated enemy's family. There is a story, likely embellished in the retelling, but revealing regardless of its precise accuracy, that on the day after the Battle of Issus, when Alexander first visited the captured royal women, Sisygambis mistook his companion Hephaestion for the king himself, since Hephaestion was taller and prostrated herself before him in error. Realizing her mistake, she was mortified until Alexander, rather than taking offense, reportedly told her gently that she had made no error at all, for Hephaestion, too, was Alexander, in the sense that mattered most, another version of himself, so close in friendship that the distinction scarcely existed. It is one of the small, quiet stories that later readers have returned to again and again, not because it changed the course of any battle, but because it reveals, in a single gentle gesture, something genuinely warm beneath the armor of conquest. That warmth extended, in its way, even to the aftermath of Alexander's own death. When news finally reached Sisygambis in Babylon that the young king who had captured her, and then, against every expectation a defeated queen might have held, treated her with sustained dignity and apparent affection for the better part of a decade, had died, she is said to have turned away from food, from light, from the company of her own remaining family, and to have died herself within a matter of days, an old woman who had outlived her own husband, the great king, her own son, Darius. And now, finally, the young conqueror who had somehow become, in the strange arithmetic of grief and captivity, something closer to a member of her own family than an enemy. With Darius fleeing eastward to regroup and raise a new army, Alexander made a decision that surprised many of his own commanders. Rather than pursuing the Persian king immediately into the heart of his empire, Alexander turned south, down the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, toward Phoenicia, Egypt, and the Levant. The reasoning was coldly practical. The Persian navy, though Alexander had no fleet capable of challenging it directly at sea, drew its strength from the ports and harbours of the Phoenician and Egyptian coast. Deny Persia those ports, and its navy would have nowhere to resupply, nowhere to shelter, no coastline from which to threaten Alexander's own supply lines back to Greece and Macedon while he pushed deeper into Asia. Better, Alexander reasoned, to secure the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline first and remove any possibility of a Persian counterstroke from the sea before committing fully to the pursuit of Darius himself. Most of the Phoenician cities submitted without a fight, recognizing the shifting tide of power. One did not. The island city of Tyre, built on a fortified rock just off the coast, protected by walls that rose directly from the sea and a formidable navy of its own, refused Alexander's demand that he be allowed to make sacrifices in the city's temple to Melkart, whom the Greeks associated with Heracles, a request that was, everyone understood, really a request for submission dressed in the language of religion. Tyre's refusal triggered one of the most extraordinary sieges in ancient military history. Since Tyre stood on an island roughly half a mile from the mainland, protected by walls too high and too well defended to be taken by ships alone, Alexander made a decision that revealed the sheer scale of his engineering ambition. He ordered his army to build a causeway, a solid mole of stone and timber extending directly out into the sea, wide enough to carry siege engines, connecting the mainland to the island fortress itself. The Tyrians resisted with everything available to them. They sent fireships to burn the causeway as it was being built. They harassed the workers with catapults and archers from their walls. They even, according to ancient accounts, heated sand and metal until it glowed, then poured it down onto Macedonian soldiers attempting to scale the walls, causing horrific burns. The siege dragged on for 7 grinding months, one of the longest and most difficult of Alexander's entire career, testing not only his engineering, but the patience and loyalty of an army that had grown, used to swift, decisive victories. The scale of the engineering effort at Tyre deserves to be understood in its own right, separate even from the drama of the fighting itself, because it reveals a dimension of Alexander's genius that battlefield tactics alone can never fully capture. The causeway his engineers built stretched roughly half a mile across open sea, wide enough at its base to carry the weight of massive siege towers many stories tall, constructed under constant harassment from Tyrian ships, catapults, and fire. When the Tyrians deployed a fireship packed with combustible material and sent it crashing into the nearly completed causeway, destroying much of the painstaking work of months in a single burning night, Alexander did not retreat from the plan. He simply began again, wider and stronger than before, this time protecting the new construction with towers of his own positioned to shield the workers from Tyrian projectiles. When the causeway alone proved insufficient to bring his forces within striking range of Tyre's formidable sea walls, Alexander turned to the sea itself. He assembled a fleet, drawing ships and crews from Phoenician cities that had already submitted to him, cities whose own sailors now found themselves manning vessels against a fellow Phoenician city that had chosen to resist, and used it to blockade Tyre's harbours entirely, cutting off any hope of relief or resupply by sea, while mounting battering rams and siege engines directly onto ships that could be manoeuvred against the weakest points in the island's sea defences. It was, by any standard of ancient warfare, an almost unimaginably complex combined operation, coordinating land-based siege engineering, an improvised navy assembled from recently conquered cities, and infantry assault, all directed toward breaking a single fortified island that many observers at the campaign's outset had considered simply impossible to take. Perhaps it is worth pausing on what this 7-month siege reveals about the particular, restless shape of Alexander's ambition, the same quality visible, in different form, throughout every chapter of his life. He could have bypassed Tyre. He could have left a smaller force to contain the city while continuing south toward Egypt, returning later, if necessary, to finish the job. Many commanders, weighing the cost against the strategic value of a single island city, would have made exactly that calculation. Alexander could not. Once Tyre had refused him, once a city had dared to tell him no, the matter became, in some deep and characteristic way, no longer simply about strategy at all. It became a question of whether the world would learn that defiance of Alexander carried a price too terrible to risk, a lesson he seemed to need to teach as thoroughly and as visibly as possible, whatever it demanded of the men who followed him, and whatever it cost the people of the city itself. In the end, Tyre fell, its walls finally breached by siege towers mounted on ships, its harbour stormed by a Macedonian fleet gathered, in the meantime, from cities that had already submitted. The city that had defied him for 7 months paid an extraordinarily heavy price. Historians believe several thousand Tyrians were killed in the final assault, and thousands more were sold into slavery. It was, alongside the destruction of Thebes years earlier, one of the darkest chapters of Alexander's career. A reminder that the same young man capable of remarkable generosity toward Darius's family could also be capable of devastating, calculated brutality when his authority was defied for too long. Perhaps, standing amid the ruins of a city that had cost him 7 months and untold Macedonian lives, Alexander understood something that would only grow more true as his empire expanded. Mercy, in his mind, was not weakness, and cruelty was not simply rage. Both were tools, deployed according to a calculation only he fully understood, what would secure the loyalty of the next city, and what would ensure that no city dared to make him wait 7 months again. After Tyre, only the city of Gaza offered further resistance along the coast, holding out for 2 brutal months under a commander named Batis, before finally falling as well. With the coastline secured, Alexander marched on into Egypt. Egypt, exhausted by generations of resented Persian rule, did not resist him at all. The Persian satrap governing the province, recognizing the futility of fighting a force that had just spent 7 months proving it would not simply go away, surrendered without a battle. Alexander entered Egypt not as a conqueror, but very nearly as a liberator, and the Egyptian priesthood, ever pragmatic about which power held their loyalty, crowned him Pharaoh, welcoming him as the legitimate ruler of the 2 lands, the successor to a line of god-kings stretching back thousands of years. It was in Egypt that Alexander made one of the most personally significant decisions of his entire campaign, a journey that had nothing to do with conquest at all. He led a small expedition deep into the Libyan desert, west of the Nile, across brutal, waterless terrain, to reach the isolated oasis of Siwa, home to a famous oracle of the god Zeus Ammon, a deity the Egyptians and Greeks had, over generations of contact, come to see as 2 faces of the same divine power. Why Alexander made this difficult and dangerous journey, so far from any military necessity, has fascinated historians for over 2,000 years. The ancient sources themselves offer only fragments and are notably, almost deliberately, vague about exactly what was said inside the oracle's sanctuary. What we do know is this: Alexander consulted the oracle privately, emerged from the encounter transformed, in some quiet, internal way that those closest to him noticed but rarely discussed openly, and from that point forward, the question of his divine parentage, the old rumour his mother Olympias had long encouraged, that his true father was not Philip but a god, seemed to settle more firmly and more publicly into how Alexander understood himself. Modern historians have also spent considerable energy exploring what, precisely, Alexander looked like, a question that sounds simple but proves surprisingly difficult to answer with confidence, since no contemporary portrait survives that we can verify was made from direct observation rather than idealized imagination. Ancient descriptions agree on certain details: a relatively short but powerfully built frame, a somewhat ruddy complexion, and a distinctive habit of tilting his head slightly to one side and gazing upward, a mannerism later sculptors exaggerated into an almost stylized signature of his image. Plutarch describes a particular sweetness to his scent, supposedly noticeable even through the sweat and grime of campaign life, which ancient writers attributed, with a kind of poetic embellishment typical of the genre, to some inherent warmth in his physical constitution. Whether any of these details reflect genuine observation passed down through reliable sources, or simply the accumulated mythology that inevitably grows around any figure remembered as more than merely human, remains, like so much else about him, a question historians can approach only with careful, humble uncertainty rather than confident conclusion. What we can say with more confidence is this: whatever Alexander actually looked like walking through the streets of Pella as a boy, or standing before the burning ruins of Bucephalus as a young emperor, or lying fevered and dying in a palace in Babylon at 32, the image the ancient world chose to remember him by, youthful, restless, gazing always towards some horizon just beyond the edge of the frame, has proven more durable than any single fact about his actual physical appearance. It is perhaps exactly the kind of immortality a boy who once kept the Iliad beneath his pillow, measuring his own brief life against the eternal fame of Achilles, would have recognized as a fair and fitting trade. Perhaps, standing in that remote desert sanctuary, so far from Macedon, so far from his father's memory and his father's kingdom, Alexander asked the question every restless, ambitious child eventually asks in some form: who am I, truly, and what am I meant to become? Whatever answer he received, or believed he received, he carried it with him for the rest of his life, and it would shape, for better and for worse, how he saw himself in relation to the men who followed him and the empire he was building. On his return journey from Siwa, passing along the Egyptian coast, Alexander is said to have noticed a stretch of land between the sea and a lake, sheltered by a small island with a natural harbour and a healthy, temperate climate. He recognized, with the eye of a man who had already begun thinking in terms of centuries rather than years, that this was an ideal location for a great city. A Greek city, positioned perfectly to become a hub of trade between Egypt, Greece, and the wider Mediterranean world. He founded the city there in early 331 BC and gave it, without excessive modesty, his own name, Alexandria. It was far from the first city he had founded, Alexandropolis, back in his Thracian campaigns, held that honour. But it would become, by far, the most significant. Within a generation of his death, Alexandria would grow into one of the great intellectual and commercial capitals of the ancient world, home to the famous Library of Alexandria and a beacon of Greek learning for centuries. It remains, to this day, one of the largest cities in Egypt, still carrying the name of the young king who paused, on his way back, from a desert oracle, to imagine it into being. With Egypt secured, a great city founded, and the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline finally denied to Persian naval power, Alexander turned east once more, back toward Mesopotamia, back toward Darius, and back toward the reckoning that both men understood was now unavoidable. Darius, in the 2 years since his flight from Issus, had not been idle. He had gathered the largest army the Persian Empire could still muster, a truly vast force drawn from every corner of his remaining territory, including war chariots fitted with scythed blades on their wheels, and, perhaps most significantly, war elephants brought from the far eastern edges of his empire, a weapon the Macedonians had never yet faced in battle. Darius chose his ground with unusual care this time, selecting a wide open plain near the village of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq, where his numerical advantage and his cavalry could finally operate without the constraints that had crippled him at Issus. He even had the ground levelled in places to give his chariots a clearer path. Everything about the coming battle suggested Darius had learned from his earlier mistake. He had chosen open ground. He had assembled overwhelming numbers. He had brought weapons Alexander had never faced before. It would not be enough. There is a texture to Alexander's campaigns that the great battles alone can never fully convey. The sheer, grinding logistics of moving an army of tens of thousands of men, along with their horses, pack animals, siege equipment, camp followers, and accumulated plunder, across 3 continents and more than 20,000 miles of some of the most difficult terrain on Earth for the better part of 13 years. Consider what such an army actually was, beneath the banners and the gleaming armour that ancient sculptors loved to depict. At its core marched the Macedonian phalanx infantry, farmers and townsmen from the hill country and river valleys of Macedon, men who had left behind small holdings and family trades to follow their king east, trained from youth in the discipline of the sarissa. Alongside them rode the companion cavalry, drawn from Macedon's noble families, men whose horses were often as carefully bred and as highly valued as any soldier's weapon. But the army that crossed into Asia in 334 BC, and the far larger, far more diverse army that eventually stood on the banks of the Hyphasis 8 years later, was never simply Macedonian. It included Greek allies from the League of Corinth, Thessalian cavalry famous throughout the Greek world for their horsemanship, Thracian and Illyrian light infantry skilled in skirmishing warfare the heavier Macedonian troops could not easily match, Cretan archers prized for their accuracy, and, as the campaign wore on and Alexander's territory expanded, increasing numbers of Persian, Bactrian, and Sogdian soldiers integrated directly into his forces, a genuinely multinational army unlike almost anything the ancient Mediterranean world had seen before. Behind the fighting men trailed an even larger population that ancient writers rarely bothered to count with any precision. Camp followers, traders, craftsmen who repaired weapons and armor, physicians who tended the wounded, and, over the years, a growing number of local wives and children born to soldiers who had settled, at least temporarily, in garrison towns scattered across the breadth of the empire. Some historians estimate that by the time Alexander's forces reached India, the total population moving with the army, soldiers and non-combatants together, may have numbered well over 100,000 people. An itinerant city larger than most of the actual cities it marched past, requiring a staggering, continuous effort simply to keep fed, watered, and moving forward. Feeding such a force was, in itself, one of the great unheralded achievements of Alexander's entire career. Ancient armies routinely starved in the field, undone not by enemy soldiers, but by simple failures of supply. And Alexander's father, Philip, had built into the Macedonian military culture an unusually rigorous approach to logistics. Soldiers trained to carry a portion of their own rations and equipment. Baggage trains kept deliberately smaller than those of rival Greek armies. And a systematic reliance on secured supply routes and depots established methodically as the army advanced, rather than the more haphazard foraging that crippled many ancient campaigns. Even so, there were moments, the Gedrosian desert chief among them, when even this careful system failed catastrophically against terrain that offered no supply at all, whatever discipline an army carried with it. Medicine, too, travelled with the army, though ancient battlefield medicine bore little resemblance to anything a modern reader would recognize. Physicians trained in the Greek medical tradition associated with Hippocrates accompanied the campaign, treating wounds with cleaning, stitching, and cauterization, setting broken bones, and, when the situation demanded it, performing what amounted to battlefield surgery under conditions modern doctors would find almost unimaginably primitive. Alexander himself was wounded seriously on multiple occasions throughout his campaigns, struck by an arrow that pierced his ankle during the siege of a fortress in Sogdiana, and, most seriously, shot through the chest by an arrow during a siege in India that very nearly killed him, leaving him so weakened that rumours of his death swept through the army before he had even fully regained consciousness, rumours he was forced, still gravely wounded, to personally disprove by having himself carried before his assembled soldiers so they could see with their own eyes that their king still lived. It is easy, telling the story of Alexander at the distance of more than 2,000 years, to see only the sweep of the great battles and the grandeur of the conquered cities, and to forget the countless smaller, harder truths beneath them. The blistered feet of a phalanx soldier who had marched further in a single decade than most people of his era travelled in an entire lifetime. The anxious calculations of quartermasters trying to feed 100,000 people in unfamiliar country, the quiet grief of a physician who had done everything possible and still lost her, patient on a foreign riverbank far from anything resembling home. Alexander's story is, in the end, not only the story of one extraordinary man, it is the story of the tens of thousands of ordinary people who made his extraordinary story possible, most of them long since forgotten, their names lost entirely to the same 2,000 years of history that made Alexander himself immortal. The Battle of Gaugamela was fought on the first day of October 331 BC, and it stands, even now, among the small handful of battles in human history that are still studied, argued over, and taught to soldiers as a masterclass in tactical thinking against overwhelming odds. Alexander's army, by most modern estimates, numbered somewhere around 47,000 men. Darius commanded a force very likely several times that size. Ancient sources, as they so often did, offered numbers in the hundreds of thousands that modern historians consider exaggerated. But even the most conservative estimates agree that Alexander was significantly, perhaps overwhelmingly, outnumbered. He did not fight like a man who was outnumbered. The night before the battle, as Alexander's camp settled in to an uneasy quiet within sight of the vast glow of Persian campfires stretching across the plain, so numerous, ancient writers claimed that the light of them alone seemed to rival the stars, Alexander's senior general Parmenion reportedly suggested a night attack, hoping to use darkness to offset Persia's numerical advantage and catch the enemy unprepared. Alexander refused. He is said to have replied that he would not steal his victory like a thief in the night, that he intended to win in the open light of day, decisively, where there could be no argument, no ambiguity, no whispered claim afterward that Persia might have won a fair fight. Whether this was pure confidence, a canny understanding of the propaganda value of an undeniable daylight victory, or simple stubbornness, the choice reveals once again how thoroughly Alexander had come to see his war against Persia not merely as a military campaign, but as something closer to a story he was writing about himself. One that needed to read a certain way for history to remember it correctly. He reportedly slept soundly that night, so soundly that his officers had to wake him on the morning of the battle, past the hour he had intended to rise, a detail ancient writers love to include as evidence of a mind utterly untroubled by fear, even facing the largest army he would ever face in his life. On the battlefield itself, Darius had arranged his forces with real care, his scythed chariots positioned to charge directly into the Macedonian line and cut through it before infantry could even engage, his elephants stationed to terrify men and horses who had never encountered such creatures before, his vastly superior cavalry positioned on both flanks to envelop the smaller Macedonian force. Entirely. Alexander's answer to this danger of encirclement was one of the most elegant tactical solutions in ancient warfare. Rather than trying to match Darius's line length, an impossible task given the disparity in numbers, he arranged a portion of his infantry and cavalry in a second line, angled back at the flanks, ready to turn and face any Persian force that tried to swing around behind him. It transformed his smaller army from a simple line, vulnerable to encirclement, into something closer to a flexible, self-protecting formation, capable of absorbing an envelopment attempt without collapsing. Then, as the battle began, Alexander did something that appeared, to Persian eyes watching from across the field, almost incomprehensible. Rather than advancing straight ahead into the strongest part of the Persian center, where Darius himself commanded, he began marching his own right wing at an angle, off to the side, away from the ground Darius had specifically leveled and prepared for his scythed chariots and cavalry. It drew Persian forces on that flank further and further from their own center, stretching Darius's line thinner and thinner as commanders scrambled to match Alexander's lateral movement and prevent him from simply marching off the edge of the prepared battlefield entirely. And then, precisely when a gap opened in the stretched and weakening Persian center, the same kind of gap he had exploited as an 18-year-old at Cheraneia, the same kind of gap he had driven through at Issus, Alexander turned his companion cavalry and drove directly at it, straight toward Darius's own position, in a wedge-shaped charge that ancient writers described almost as a spear thrown at the very heart of the Persian king. Watch him, in the moment before that final charge, reins gathered in one hand, the other steady on the shaft of his lance, the whole vast machinery of two empires balanced for one suspended breath on the decision of a single rider choosing exactly when to move. Around him, the noise of tens of thousands of men and horses had become something almost beyond sound. A single continuous roar pressing against the ears until it stopped registering as noise at all, and became instead a kind of physical pressure, a weight in the chest. Ahead, through the dust and the glinting bronze, the gap in the Persian line that his entire tactical plan had been built to create. He did not hesitate. He never did. Whatever fear an ordinary man might have felt facing an army large enough to blot out the horizon, seems, in every surviving account of him, to have simply never registered as a reason to slow down. Perhaps this, more than any single victory, is the truest measure of what made him who he was. Not the tactics, brilliant as they were, and not even the raw physical courage, remarkable as that also was, but the particular, almost frightening totality of his conviction in the instant that mattered most. Other commanders calculated risk. Alexander, in the moment of decision, seemed almost incapable of imagining failure as a genuine possibility. A quality that had nearly gotten him killed at the Granicus, that would nearly get him killed again in India, and that had, so far, at every single crossroads of his young life, proven remarkably, almost unnervingly correct. Darius, for the second time in two great battles, broke and fled the field before the fighting reached him directly. And for the second time, the flight of the great king unravelled the discipline of the entire vast Persian army behind him, faster and more completely than any tactical defeat alone could have. An army built around the person of the king found itself, once again, leaderless and disintegrating, even in places where individual units were still fighting effectively and might, under different circumstances, have turned the tide. Gaugamela was, in every meaningful sense, the end of the Persian Empire as an independent power capable of resisting Alexander. Darius survived the battle, fleeing eastward into the mountains, but he would never again command an army capable of standing against the Macedonians. The empire that had ruled from the Aegean to the Indus for more than 200 years, the empire that had once nearly conquered Greece itself, had been broken decisively and finally by a 25-year-old king with an army a fraction of its size. What followed was less a war than a triumphal procession through the wealthiest cities on earth. Babylon, one of the greatest and most ancient cities in the world, opened its gates without resistance, its governor greeting Alexander with garlands and offerings, its streets lined with incense as he entered. A city so wealthy and so magnificent that even Alexander's own hardened soldiers, veterans of years of campaigning, were reportedly stunned into silence by its scale. He was welcomed there, as in Egypt, not merely as a conqueror, but with something close to religious reverence, and he took care, as he often did in newly conquered territories, to respect local customs and religious institutions, making offerings to the Babylonian god Marduk and confirming local officials in their positions, rather than replacing them wholesale with Macedonians. For men who had marched out of the hill country of Macedon, past dusty Thracian border towns and modest Greek coastal cities, nothing in their lives had prepared them for what they found inside Babylon's walls. Its famous hanging terraces, its towering ziggurat dedicated to Marduk, its broad processional way lined with glazed brick lions in blue and gold, its markets heavy with spices and silks from trade routes stretching further east than any Macedonian had ever travelled. All of it must have felt, to soldiers who had spent a decade sleeping in field camps and mountain passes, almost impossibly unreal, a city built by a civilization the Greeks had always regarded with a mixture of fear and fascination, as older and richer than their own could ever hope to become. Alexander allowed his exhausted army an extended rest in Babylon, weeks of feasting and recovery after the brutal march and the grinding tension of Gaugamela, a pause that surely did as much for the army's flagging morale as any victory speech could have. From Babylon, he marched to Susa, one of the Persian Empire's great administrative capitals, which surrendered its treasury intact, an almost unimaginable fortune in gold and silver, accumulated over generations of imperial taxation, now entirely in Alexander's hands. And from Susa, he marched toward Bucephalus, the ceremonial and spiritual heart of the Persian Empire, the city where Persian kings had been crowned for 2 centuries, the most sacred and symbolically important city in the entire empire he had just conquered. Before its fires reduced it to a memory, Bucephalus was, by every ancient account, one of the most magnificent architectural achievements the world had ever seen. Its great terrace, raised high above the surrounding plain, was reached by a monumental double staircase carved so gently that ancient sources claim horses could climb it without difficulty. Its Apadana, the great audience hall where Persian kings had received tribute from every corner of their empire for 2 centuries, was supported by dozens of towering stone columns, many crowned with sculpted bulls and mythical creatures rising higher than almost any covered space in the ancient world. Its walls were carved with long processions of relief sculpture depicting delegations from every subject people of the empire: Medes and Elamites, Egyptians and Bactrians, Indians and Ionian Greeks, each bringing tribute befitting their homeland, a stone record, still remarkably preserved even today, of just how vast and how genuinely diverse the empire Alexander had conquered truly was. Alexander is said to have been visibly struck, on first entering the complex, by its scale and its beauty, struck enough that his eventual decision to burn it, whatever combination of calculation and drunken impulse, actually lay behind that decision. Cost the world something that no later conquest, however glorious, could ever restore. Modern archaeologists, excavating the site in the centuries since, have found clear physical evidence of the fire's intensity in that final section of the palace complex, scorched stone and ash layers that confirm, in the unforgiving language of the archaeological record, exactly how thoroughly that single night of flame consumed what 2 centuries of Persian kings had built. Bucephalus fell to him with its vast treasury largely intact, an even greater fortune than Susa had yielded. Historians believe the combined wealth Alexander captured across these Persian treasuries would be almost impossible to translate into any comparable modern figure, but it was, by any measure, one of the largest transfers of wealth in the ancient world. And then, several months into his occupation of the city, in a decision that has puzzled and troubled historians for over 2,000 years, Alexander ordered the royal palace of Bucephalus burned to the ground. The ancient sources offer several competing explanations, and it is entirely possible more than one was true at once. Some accounts suggest it was a calculated act of political theatre, a symbolic destruction of the seat of Persian royal power, a final, unmistakable message to the entire empire that the age of the Achaemenid kings was finished and would never return, payment in flame for the Persian burning of Athens generations earlier during the Greek wars. Other accounts, more colourful and considerably more troubling, describe a night of heavy drinking, a celebration that spiralled out of control, and a courtesan named Thais, who is said to have suggested, amid the wine and the noise, that they burn the palace themselves in revenge for Persia's old crimes against Greece. A suggestion Alexander, in the heat of the moment, is said to have taken up with a torch in his own hand, leading a drunken procession that set the great palace ablaze. Whether it was calculated policy or a decision made in wine and impulse, historians largely agree it is one of the few genuine regrets Alexander is recorded as having expressed later in life. The destruction of Bucephalus, whatever message it sent in the moment, cost him something too, a permanent physical loss of one of the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient world, and perhaps, in the sober light of the following morning, a small crack in the careful image of a magnanimous, Persian-respecting ruler he had otherwise worked hard to build. Perhaps, standing before the flames, watching 2 centuries of Persian royal history collapse into ash and ember, Alexander felt for the first time something he would feel again, more sharply, in the years ahead, the strange, hollow uncertainty of a man who has just achieved everything he set out to achieve, and does not yet know what comes next. Darius, meanwhile, was still alive, fleeing eastward with a shrinking group of loyalists, increasingly seen by his own remaining nobles not as a king worth dying for, but as a liability. In the summer of 330 BC, a group of Darius's own satraps, led by a nobleman named Bessus, turned against their king. When Alexander's forces, in relentless pursuit, finally caught up with the fleeing Persian party, they found Darius III already dying, stabbed by his own men and left behind, abandoned in a wagon as Bessus fled further east with the remnants of the royal court. Alexander is said to have arrived at the wagon only minutes after Darius had died, too late to speak with him, but not too late to see. Perhaps the strange, quiet end of the man he had chased across half of Asia. He treated Darius's body with full royal honours, sending it back to Bucephalus for burial among the tombs of the Persian kings who had come before him, and declared Bessus, who had murdered his own sovereign, a usurper and a criminal to be hunted down and punished, a declaration that positioned Alexander, in the eyes of the Persian nobility and people, not simply as a conqueror who had defeated Darius, but as the legitimate avenger of a murdered king, and by extension, the rightful heir to the throne Darius had left behind. Consider, for a moment, what it must have felt like to stand in the Macedonian line at Gaugamela that morning, watching the vast Persian host stretch away toward the horizon in every direction, more men than most of Alexander's soldiers had ever seen gathered in a single place, chariots with blades mounted on their wheels, glinting in the morning sun, and, for the first time in any of their lives, the low, unfamiliar rumble of war elephants somewhere along the Persian line. An animal most of these Macedonian farm boys and hill country soldiers had only ever heard described in travellers' tales, if they had heard of them at all. Fear, on a battlefield like that, is not a single feeling. It moves through an army the way weather moves across a plain, starting somewhere at the edges, in the whispered uncertainty of men who can see, better than anyone, exactly how badly outnumbered they are, and either spreading into panic or, if the men trust their commander enough, hardening instead into a strange, focused calm. Ancient writers, describing the mood in the Macedonian camp on the eve of Gaugamela, insist it was the latter, not because the danger was any less real, but because these men had followed Alexander through the Granicus and through Issus, had watched him lead the decisive charge himself in both battles rather than commanding from safety, and had learned, through hard experience, that his confidence, however audacious it appeared from the outside, tended to be earned rather than reckless. He was 25 years old. He had, in 6 years, destroyed the greatest empire the world had ever known. It is worth lingering here, at the summit of it all, before the story begins its long, complicated descent, because this was the peak, in every sense the word can carry. Never again would Alexander stand quite so unambiguously triumphant, quite so beloved by the men who followed him, quite so free of the shadows that would gather, one by one, over the years still ahead of him. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scale of what he now commanded. From the coast of the Aegean to the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, from the Nile to the plains of Mesopotamia, Alexander governed, directly or through officials answerable only to him, a territory larger than any single ruler in the history of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world had ever controlled. The treasuries of Susa and Bucephalus alone had placed in his hands a fortune so vast that ancient writers, straining for comparison, could only describe it in terms of the entire accumulated tax revenue of the Persian Empire across multiple generations, sitting now in Macedonian hands, ready to fund whatever campaigns, cities, or ambitions Alexander chose to pursue next. And yet, wealth alone, Alexander understood with a clarity that set him apart from most conquerors before or since, was not the same thing as a functioning empire. A treasury could be looted in an afternoon. Holding a territory, actually governing it, feeding it, keeping its roads safe and its taxes flowing, and its countless different peoples, with their countless different languages, gods and grievances, from tearing each other apart the moment his army marched on to the next campaign, required something far more patient and far more difficult than any battlefield victory. This is where Alexander's approach to empire revealed its most genuinely innovative quality, the aspect of his rule that historians have come, in the centuries since, to regard as perhaps his most significant and most underappreciated achievement. Rather than replacing the entire Persian administrative structure with Macedonian officials, a system he did not have nearly enough trained Macedonians to staff even if he had wanted to, Alexander largely kept the existing Persian system of satraps, provincial governors, intact, often confirming Persian nobles who had served Darius in their positions, provided they demonstrated loyalty to their new king. He paired these Persian administrators, in most provinces, with Macedonian military commanders responsible for garrisons and security, creating a hybrid system that blended Persian administrative expertise, honed over 2 centuries of governing this same vast territory, with Macedonian military oversight to ensure loyalty. It was a pragmatic solution, and also, in its way, a genuinely respectful one, an acknowledgement, unusual among ancient conquerors, that the people he had conquered possessed systems of governance worth preserving rather than simply destroying. He adopted, in various provinces, elements of Persian royal dress and ceremony, not merely from personal vanity, but from a calculated understanding that Persian subjects, accustomed for centuries to certain visual and ceremonial markers of legitimate kingship, would more readily accept his authority if he did not appear in their eyes as a foreign barbarian occupying their sacred institutions, but as something closer to a legitimate successor to the Persian throne itself, the avenger of the murdered Darius, rather than merely his conqueror. This same instinct shaped how Alexander treated the diverse religious traditions scattered across his new empire. In Egypt, he had been crowned pharaoh and made offerings to Egyptian gods. In Babylon, he honored Marduk and the Babylonian priesthood. Wherever his armies marched, Alexander showed a consistent pattern of respecting, funding, and participating in local religious customs rather than imposing Greek religion upon conquered populations. A policy that stands in notable contrast to the more culturally aggressive approaches of many later empires, and one that surely eased, in countless towns and cities across his territory, the practical business of transitioning from Persian rule to Macedonian rule with a minimum of ongoing local resistance. Perhaps walking through the treasure-filled halls of Bucephalus before the fires that would later consume them, or reviewing tax records in Babylon with Persian officials who had served Darius only months before, Alexander felt something that the battlefield alone could never have given him, a growing sense that he was not merely a conqueror passing through, but the architect of something meant to endure, a fusion of East and West he was beginning, however imperfectly and however gradually, to imagine into being. It was an extraordinary vision for a man not yet 26 years old. It would also, in the years immediately ahead, cost him more than he could have imagined on this triumphant plain. In the loyalty of the oldest friends who had followed him from Macedon, in the patience of an army that had begun to wonder whether their king still fully belonged to them, and in the widening, increasingly painful distance between the young prince who had once wept when his father called Macedon too small for him, and the god-touched emperor he was slowly, irreversibly becoming. Alexander had conquered an empire. What he had not yet conquered was its farthest edges, the wild, mountainous provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana, in what is now Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, where the usurper Bessus had fled with the last fragments of Persian resistance, and where the terrain itself seemed determined to resist him as fiercely as any army. The campaign that followed, stretching across nearly 3 grueling years, was unlike anything Alexander had faced before. There were no more great set-piece battles like Issus or Gaugamela, no single dramatic afternoon that could break an empire's will to resist. Instead, there was mountain after mountain, fortress after fortress, and an enemy that refused to stand and fight in the open, preferring instead to strike from ambush and vanish back into terrain the Macedonians barely understood. It was, in many ways, the hardest fighting of Alexander's entire career, grinding, frustrating, and far more costly in the slow attrition of men and patience than any of his famous victories had been. Bessus himself was eventually betrayed by his own allies and handed over to Alexander, who had him mutilated in the Persian fashion reserved for traitors to the crown, his nose and ears cut off, before sending him to Persian nobles for formal execution, a punishment that framed Alexander, once again, as the legitimate avenger of Darius rather than simply another conqueror. The mutilated punishment inflicted on Bessus reflects a broader pattern worth understanding, since Persian custom around royal betrayal differed considerably from the Greek and Macedonian traditions Alexander had grown up within. In Persian tradition, a usurper who had killed his own king committed a crime understood as an offense against the cosmic order itself, not merely against one man's political interests, and the punishments reserved for such crimes were correspondingly severe, intended to mark the offender publicly and permanently before whatever formal execution eventually followed. Alexander's decision to hand Bessus over to Persian nobles for judgment, rather than executing him by Macedonian methods himself, was itself a calculated piece of political theatre, a signal, once again, that Alexander understood himself to be acting within Persian tradition and Persian legitimacy, avenging a Persian king according to Persian custom, rather than simply imposing a foreign conqueror's justice on a defeated people. But defeating Bessus did not end the resistance. Local warlords and fortress holders across Sogdiana continued fighting, and Alexander found himself besieging strongholds perched on cliffs so remote and seemingly impregnable that their defenders reportedly laughed at his demands for surrender, telling him he would need soldiers with wings to reach them. Alexander, characteristically, found a way. At the fortress known as the Sogdian Rock, he called for volunteers willing to scale the sheer cliff face at night using tent pegs and ropes. A small party succeeded, appearing on the heights above the fortress at dawn, and the stunned defenders, believing Alexander's army had somehow grown wings after all, surrendered without further resistance. Bessus's capture, however, did not end the resistance in the region, and it was here that Alexander faced the single most persistent and frustrating adversary of his entire military career, a Sogdian nobleman named Spitames, who understood far better than any Persian general Alexander had faced in open battle that the Macedonian war machine. Built for decisive pitched confrontations like Gaugamela, was far less suited to the kind of war Spitames intended to wage instead. Swift raids on isolated garrisons, ambushes on supply columns moving through narrow mountain passes, and a persistent refusal to ever offer Alexander the single climactic battle he had used to break every previous enemy he had faced. For nearly 3 years, Spitames harried the Macedonian occupation of Bactria and Sogdiana, inflicting genuine defeats on detached Macedonian forces on more than one occasion, a rare and uncomfortable experience for an army that had, until now, associated its king's name with unbroken victory. Alexander responded by dividing his own forces into smaller, more mobile columns, better suited to the mountainous terrain, and by pursuing a policy of establishing fortified garrison towns throughout the region, a network of new cities, several more of them bearing some form of his own name, intended to project permanent Macedonian authority into territory that had never fully answered to any distant ruler, Persian or otherwise. It was exhausting, frustrating, unglamorous warfare fought in brutal mountain winters and scorching desert summers, utterly unlike the swift, decisive campaigns that had carried Alexander from the Hellespont to Bucephalus in less time than this single regional pacification would eventually consume. Spitames was finally betrayed and killed by his own allies late in 328 BC. Exhausted local tribes deciding, much as Bessus's own officers once had, that continued resistance to Alexander was no longer worth the cost it demanded of them. His head, according to ancient accounts, was sent to Alexander as proof and as a peace offering, a grim final resolution to 3 years of warfare that had taught Alexander, more thoroughly than any battle against Darius ever had, just how differently power must be exercised against an enemy who refuses to stand and be conquered in a single afternoon. It was at this same fortress, according to ancient sources, that Alexander first encountered a young noblewoman named Roxana, the daughter of a local Bactrian chieftain who had taken refuge there with her family. Multiple ancient accounts agree that Alexander was genuinely struck by her, and that theirs was, unusually for a royal marriage of the period, at least partly a match of personal attraction rather than pure political calculation, though the political value of the union, binding Alexander by marriage to the region's fractious nobility, was surely not lost on him either. They married in 327 BC, in a ceremony that blended Macedonian and local customs, and Roxana would remain with Alexander for the rest of his life, eventually bearing his only acknowledged child, a son born after Alexander's own death. The years in Bactria and Sogdiana changed Alexander in ways that went beyond marriage. Increasingly, having spent years now ruling over conquered Persian territory, adopting elements of Persian court dress, and surrounding himself with Persian nobles and administrators he had chosen to keep in power rather than replace, Alexander began asking something of his Macedonian and Greek followers that many of them found deeply unsettling. He began encouraging, and in some contexts requiring, the Persian court custom of proskynesis, a ritual gesture of respect performed before the king, involving varying degrees of bowing or prostration depending on the rank of the person performing it. To Persians, long accustomed to their kings being treated with something close to sacred reverence, this was unremarkable court etiquette. To Macedonians and Greeks, raised in a culture that reserved such prostration for the gods alone, and that took genuine pride in the idea that free men bowed to no mortal ruler, it looked like something far more troubling. Evidence that their king, seduced by the luxury and absolute authority of Persian kingship, was beginning to see himself as something more than a man among his own people. Something closer to the divine status the oracle at Siwa had once, perhaps, suggested to him. The tension came to a head at a formal court gathering where Alexander attempted to introduce the practice more broadly among his own companions. The historian Callisthenes, a nephew of Aristotle who had accompanied the campaign as its official chronicler, openly refused to perform the gesture, arguing, in front of the assembled court, that such honours belonged to the gods alone, and that no Greek should be asked to render them to a living man, however great his achievements. The moment was humiliating for Alexander, and it marked, in the eyes of many historians, the beginning of a serious and lasting rift between the king and the more traditionally minded Greeks and Macedonians who had followed him from the very beginning of the campaign, men who had grown up beside him, who had shared his early victories, and who increasingly felt they were watching their king become someone unrecognizable. This growing distance between Alexander and his oldest companions did not remain merely a matter of etiquette and wounded pride. It curdled, over the following months, into something far darker. A conspiracy was uncovered, or claimed to be uncovered, implicating Philotas, the son of Alexander's most senior and most respected general, Parmenion, in a plot against the king's life. Whether the conspiracy was genuine, or whether Philotas was guilty of nothing more than failing to report a plot he had heard rumours of, or whether the entire affair was manufactured or exaggerated by rivals eager to see the powerful Parmenion family removed from its influential position, remains genuinely disputed among historians to this day. What is certain is the outcome. Philotas was tried before the assembled army, tortured to extract a confession, and executed. And then, in a decision that shocked even hardened veterans of years of brutal campaigning, Alexander made the calculation that Parmenion himself, the elder statesman general who had served Alexander's father before him, who had guided and steadied the young king through his earliest, most uncertain campaigns, who was, at that moment, far away commanding a separate force and entirely uninvolved in his own son's alleged conspiracy, could not safely be allowed to live, now that his son had been executed as a traitor. A rider was sent ahead of any news of Philotas's death, carrying secret orders to the officers guarding Parmenion. He was killed before he ever learned what had happened to his son, killed not for any crime of his own, but for the simple, cold political calculation that a grieving, powerful old general with decades of loyalty from the army might not forgive what had been done to his family. It was, by any measure, one of the darkest and most calculated acts of Alexander's entire life, a moment where the line between a king protecting his throne and a tyrant eliminating a perceived threat becomes almost impossible to distinguish. Worse, in some ways more personally devastating, was still to come. In the autumn of 328 BC, at a drinking party in Samarkand, the kind of long, wine-heavy evening that had become an increasingly common and increasingly dangerous feature of Alexander's court in these later years, an argument broke out between Alexander and Clytus, the very officer who had saved his life at the Granicus river nearly 7 years earlier, severing the arm of the Persian nobleman about to strike Alexander down from behind. The argument, fueled by wine on both sides, spiraled from mockery into genuine fury. Clytus, increasingly bitter about the growing adoption of Persian customs and what he saw as Alexander's diminishing respect for the Macedonian veterans who had won him his empire, began comparing Alexander unfavourably to his father Philip, mocking the achievements Alexander had claimed as uniquely his own, and reportedly reminding him, with cutting precision, that it had been Clytus's own hand that had saved his life once, a debt Alexander now seemed to have forgotten amid his Persian robes and his Persian flattery. Alexander, enraged, reached for a weapon. His companions physically restrained him and hurried Clytus from the room, hoping the crisis would pass with mourning and sobriety, as so many drunken arguments do. But Clytus, apparently unwilling to let the confrontation end there, returned to continue the argument. Alexander, in a moment of blind fury that ancient sources describe with a kind of horrified fascination, seized a spear from a guard and ran his old friend through, killing him almost instantly. The wine-fueled rage drained from him almost as quickly as it had come, and what followed, by every ancient account, was a collapse of genuine, devastating grief. Alexander is said to have wept over Clytus's body, tried to fall on the same spear himself before his companions stopped him, and remained in his tent for 3 days afterward, refusing food or water, inconsolable at what he had done to the man who had once saved his life on a riverbank in Asia Minor, years and an entire empire ago. Perhaps, in those 3 dark days, Alexander understood something about himself that the glory of Issus and Gaugamela had never forced him to confront, that the same fire that drove him to conquer the world, the same refusal to accept limits that had let him tame an unridable horse and break an unbeatable army, could turn, without warning, into something capable of destroying the people he loved most. Power had made him extraordinary. It had also increasingly made him dangerous, even to those closest to him, and there was no oracle, no god, no ritual he could perform that would ever fully undo what had happened in that tent in Samarkand. The killing of Clytus was followed, within a year, by one final rupture with the old guard of his companions. A group of royal pages, young Macedonian nobles serving in Alexander's personal court, part of a traditional system of training future officers, were discovered plotting against the king's life, reportedly motivated by resentment over increasingly harsh treatment and, again, discomfort with Alexander's growing embrace of Persian customs. The pages were executed, and Callisthenes, the court historian who had refused to perform proskynesis, and who was believed, rightly or wrongly, to have influenced the pages with his own outspoken criticism of the king, was arrested and died in custody. Accounts differ as to whether he was executed outright or died from the harsh conditions of his imprisonment. By this stage of the campaign, the atmosphere within Alexander's own court had shifted into something noticeably darker than the camaraderie of the earliest years crossing the Hellespont. Where Alexander's companions had once spoken to him with the easy, unguarded frankness of men who had grown up alongside him, trained together under Aristotle, and fought side by side since Chaeronea, a new caution had crept into how even his closest officers chose their words in his presence. The executions of Philotas and Parmenion had demonstrated unmistakably that suspicion of disloyalty, whether proven or merely alleged, could prove fatal even to a man whose family had served the Macedonian crown for a generation. The killing of Clytus had shown that even old, deeply personal debts of friendship offered no guaranteed protection once wine and wounded pride entered a room together. It is little wonder, against this backdrop, that a group of young pages, boys serving in the traditional Macedonian system that trained the next generation of officers by placing them in close, intimate proximity to the king himself, eventually convinced themselves, rightly or wrongly, that Alexander had become a threat serious enough to justify a plot against his life, or that Alexander, upon discovering the plot, responded with the same uncompromising severity he had shown to every previous challenge to his authority. It is one of the harder truths of Alexander's later years to sit with honestly, that the same qualities which had made him beloved by an army in his 20s, decisive, uncompromising, utterly certain of his own judgment, curdled by his early 30s, surrounded by conquered wealth and unchecked power on a scale no advisor or old friend could fully counterbalance, into something that increasingly resembled the very tyranny his own Greek education had once taught him through Aristotle's careful political philosophy to regard with genuine suspicion. The death of Callisthenes cast a long shadow over Alexander's reputation among the Greek intellectual world back home. a world that had once celebrated him as Aristotle's most brilliant student, and now increasingly whispered that ambition and Eastern luxury had transformed him into something closer to the very kind of absolute, unaccountable tyrant that Greek philosophy had always warned against. It is worth noting, too, how the relationship between Alexander and his old tutor Aristotle had changed by this point in the campaign, since it offers a quiet, sorrowful counterpoint to the intellectual partnership that had once defined Alexander's boyhood at Mysa. Aristotle's own nephew, Callisthenes, had travelled with the campaign for years as its official historian, and his execution, or death in custody, depending on which ancient account is followed, following the page's conspiracy, placed a permanent, unhealed strain between Alexander and the philosopher who had shaped so much of his early education. Aristotle, according to later tradition, never fully forgave Alexander for his nephew's death, and the warm, curious correspondence the two men are said to have maintained in the campaign's earlier years, Alexander sending specimens of unfamiliar plants and animals back to Athens, Aristotle offering counsel on matters of governance and philosophy from the safety of his school, appears to have cooled considerably in Alexander's final years. One more example of a relationship, once central to his life, quietly eroded by the same growing distance and suspicion that had already cost him Clytus, Parmenion, and Philotas. There is something quietly tragic in this particular loss, more than the others in certain respects, because it represents not a rupture born of court intrigue or battlefield politics, but the slow, sad drifting apart of a student and a teacher who had once shared, in the quiet groves of Mysa, something that looked very much like genuine intellectual love, a bond neither conquest nor empire ever quite managed to replace. By the end of these years in Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander had married a local princess, fathered no legitimate heir yet, buried the loyal friend who had saved his life, executed the general who had helped build his father's army, and watched the trust of his oldest companions erode into something closer to wary, careful distance. He had also, in that same span of years, conquered territory no Greek army had ever come close to reaching. There is a particular kind of loneliness, historians and biographers have long suspected, that settles over a man who has outclimbed everyone he once considered his equal. By this point in the campaign, nearly 7 years into a war that had begun as an expedition of Greek liberation and had become something closer to a personal, almost cosmic ambition, Alexander was surrounded, more and more, not by companions who had known him since boyhood, but by a newer, more careful kind of court, officials and courtiers who had learned to read his moods, to flatter where flattery was rewarded, and to stay quiet where old friends like Clytus had once felt free to speak bluntly, even harshly, without fear. The soldiers who remained loyal to him, and the vast majority did remain loyal, throughout even the darkest of these years, followed him now less out of the boyish, world-changing excitement of the earliest campaigns against Persia, and more out of a deeper, more complicated mixture of habit, fear, genuine admiration, and the simple, practical recognition that they had marched too far from home to imagine any other life for themselves. An entire generation of Macedonian soldiers had grown into middle age on the march, many of them taking local wives and fathering children in garrison towns scattered from Asia Minor to Bactria, an army slowly becoming, almost without anyone quite deciding it should, something less like a Macedonian expeditionary force and more like a wandering nation unto itself, with Alexander as its soul, unifying increasingly unknowable center. Perhaps this, more than any single decision or any single act of violence, was the truest cost of the power Alexander had accumulated. Not the death of Clytus, terrible as that night in Samarkand had been, not the execution of Parmenion, cold and calculated as that decision surely was, but the slower, quieter erosion of everything that had once made him recognizable to his men, and perhaps, in his rare moments of stillness, to himself. The boy who had turned a frightened horse away from its own shadow, who understood, with an almost tender precision, exactly what that animal needed in order to trust him, had become a man increasingly surrounded by people too frightened of him to tell him the truth. And still, even now, having conquered more territory than any Greek in history had ever imagined possible, having buried friends and executed generals and married a Bactrian princess in a fortress once thought impossible to reach, Alexander was not finished. Ahead of him, beyond the towering, snow-capped mountains of the Hindu Kush, lay a land the Greeks knew only through fragments of rumour and half-mythical travellers' tales. A land, they said, of unimaginable wealth, of monsoon rains that fell for months at a time, of enormous grey beasts that could crush a man beneath a single foot, and, Alexander had increasingly convinced himself, of the very edge of the inhabited world where the land finally gave way to the great encircling ocean the Greeks believed surrounded all of creation. He had told his men, in the aftermath of Gaugamela, that he intended to make himself the ruler of all Asia. He had, by any reasonable measure, already done so. But reasonable measures, by this point in his life, had stopped applying to Alexander in any way that mattered. There was still more world ahead of him. He intended to see all of it. India was waiting. It is worth pausing here to consider the man himself, not the general, not the king, but the particular human being who moved through all of these extraordinary events, because ancient writers, fascinated as they were by his conquests, also left behind a surprising wealth of detail about his personal habits, his temperament, and the small human contradictions that made him who he was. He was, by most ancient accounts, physically restless in a way that bordered on the compulsive. A man who found stillness genuinely difficult, who preferred to conduct business while walking rather than seated, and who slept, by several accounts, remarkably little for a man carrying the weight of an entire empire on his decisions. He ate, according to Plutarch, with notable moderation for a king of his era, more interested in the company and conversation of a meal than in its extravagance, though this personal restraint seemed to loosen considerably as the campaign wore on into its later years, when the long drinking parties that would eventually cost Clitus his life became an increasingly regular feature of court life. Ancient writers debate, without ever fully resolving it, whether Alexander's growing reliance on wine in his final years reflected genuine excess or simply the ordinary habits of Macedonian court culture, in which long, heavy drinking was a normal and expected part of aristocratic male social life, though even by that culture's own standards. Several ancient sources suggest Alexander's later drinking had become notably heavier than what even Macedonian custom considered ordinary. He read constantly, even on campaign, and reportedly wrote to his officers back in Greece requesting new books and copies of tragedies and poetry to be sent to him as his supply lines allowed, a detail that captures, more vividly than almost any battlefield anecdote, just how thoroughly Aristotle's early teaching had embedded itself in him. He was, by several accounts, an unusually attentive and generous friend when his temper was not provoked, quick to reward loyalty with genuine warmth, and quick, in the same breath, to explosive and occasionally devastating rage when he felt betrayed, mocked, or defied, a combination of generosity and volatility that made him, by every account, a genuinely difficult man to predict, capable in the same year of weeping with grief over a friend he had killed himself and coldly ordering the execution of a general whose only crime was being the father of an accused conspirator. He was also, throughout his life, a man who took the visual language of his own image seriously in a way that few rulers before him had. He is said to have permitted only a small handful of trusted artists to create official portraits and sculptures of him, the sculptor Lysippos and the painter Apelles chief among them, precisely because he understood. With an instinct that modern image consultants would recognize immediately, how powerfully a carefully controlled visual legacy could shape the way an entire empire and all the centuries that followed it would remember him. The tilted head, the windswept hair, the intense upward gaze toward some distant horizon that became the standard way later sculptors depicted him, much of it originated. Historians believe, from choices Alexander himself made about how he wished to be seen, a young king already, even in his 20s, thinking carefully about how his own myth should look once he was no longer alive to shape it further. In the spring of 327 BC, Alexander led his army across the Hindu Kush mountains and down into the Indus Valley, entering a world the Greeks had only ever encountered in the half-mythical accounts of earlier travelers, a land of monsoon rains unlike anything Macedonians had experienced, of unfamiliar gods and unfamiliar customs, and of an animal that would soon become one of the most enduring images of his entire campaign, the war elephant, deployed in numbers far greater than the handful Darius had brought to Gaugamela. Several local rulers submitted to him without resistance, recognizing, as so many had before them, the futility of standing against an army that had already destroyed the Persian Empire. One did not. King Porus, ruler of a kingdom between the Hydaspes and Assassines rivers, gathered his forces, including, by most ancient accounts, somewhere around 200 war elephants, on the eastern bank of the Hydaspes River and prepared to make Alexander pay dearly for any crossing. The Battle of the Hydaspes, fought in the summer of 326 BC, was in many ways the most tactically demanding battle Alexander ever fought, and certainly the most dangerous encounter with an entirely unfamiliar weapon of war. The river itself, swollen with monsoon rain, was a formidable obstacle on its own. Porus positioned his forces, including his elephants, directly opposite the most obvious crossing points, watching Alexander's camp with careful attention for any sign of a crossing attempt. Alexander's solution was a masterpiece of deception and patience. Rather than attempting a single direct crossing, he spent days moving troops up and down the riverbank, feinting crossings at multiple points, sounding false alarms at night, gradually training Porus's forces to see these movements as routine noise rather than genuine threats. Then, under cover of a violent storm that masked the sound of his movements, Alexander led a substantial force upstream under darkness, crossed the swollen river at a point Porus had not adequately guarded, and positioned his army to strike before Porus fully understood what had happened. The battle that followed was hard fought and genuinely uncertain for long stretches. The war elephants, in particular, caused real terror among Macedonian horses unaccustomed to their size and smell, and Porus himself, seated on his own elephant, fought with a personal courage that impressed even his enemies. But Alexander's tactical flexibility and his cavalry's ability to eventually turn the elephants back against their own lines in the chaos of battle gradually won the day. Porus, wounded multiple times but refusing to flee even as his army collapsed around him, was finally captured. By the time the fighting ended, Alexander's army had won its costliest victory in years, not necessarily in the raw number of dead, which by most estimates remained lower than the casualties of his great battles against Persia, but in something harder to measure and in its own way. More corrosive to an army's confidence, the genuine, lingering terror the war elephants had inspired in men who had never imagined facing such creatures in battle, and the growing, unspoken realization among Alexander's veterans that the deeper they pushed into India, the larger and more numerous these animals seemed to become, if the rumors reaching them about kingdoms further east held any truth at all. Porus himself, towering by most ancient accounts well over 6 feet tall, mounted on his own elephant throughout the battle and wounded repeatedly, refused every opportunity to flee even as his army disintegrated around him. A display of raw physical courage that visibly impressed Alexander, who reportedly rode out personally to meet the wounded king as he was finally brought from the field. Rather than receiving him as a humbled prisoner in the more distant, ceremonial fashion a lesser conqueror might have chosen. When Alexander asked the defeated king how he wished to be treated, Porus is said to have replied simply, as a king should treat another king. Alexander, moved by the answer and by the courage Porus had shown throughout the battle, not only spared him but restored him to his throne, expanding his territory rather than diminishing it, and the two men reportedly formed a genuine mutual respect that lasted for the rest of Porus's reign as one of Alexander's regional allies. It was also here, on the banks of the Hydaspes, that Alexander suffered one of the quieter, more personal losses of his campaign. His beloved horse Bucephalus, the same wild animal a 12-year-old Alexander had tamed by turning it away from its own shadow, died shortly after the battle, from wounds, from age, or simply from the accumulated exhaustion of 2 decades carrying Alexander across 3 continents. Ancient sources are not entirely certain. Alexander, grieving, founded a city on the spot and named it Bucephala, in honor of the animal that had carried him from a Macedonian training ground to the edge of India itself. India, for all the hardship it demanded, left Alexander and his companions with impressions unlike anything the rest of the campaign had offered. The monsoon itself was a genuine revelation to men raised in the dry Mediterranean climate of Greece and Macedon. Weeks of continuous, drenching rain unlike anything they had experienced. Turning roads to mud, swelling rivers to dangerous new heights, and testing the army's endurance in ways no desert crossing or mountain pass ever quite had. The wildlife, too, seemed to belong to an entirely different register of reality. Not only the war elephants that had so unsettled the army at the Hydaspes, but monkeys, parrots, and, according to several ancient accounts, reports of enormous snakes that Alexander's soldiers, prone to exaggeration after months in unfamiliar terrain, described in terms bordering on the mythical. Perhaps most striking to Alexander personally, given everything his own education under Aristotle had instilled in him, were his encounters with Indian philosophers, ascetic holy men the Greeks called gymnosophists, naked philosophers, for their practice of renouncing material possessions entirely. Ancient accounts describe Alexander seeking out these men, genuinely curious about their teachings on the nature of the world and the proper way to live, and record at least one exchange in which a gymnosophist, asked by Alexander why he should not simply be killed if he refused to answer questions put to him, reportedly replied that death would only free him from a body he no longer needed, an answer said to have left even Alexander. A man not easily unsettled by anything, genuinely thoughtful for some time afterward. It is one of the quieter, less celebrated moments of the entire Indian campaign, and also, in its way, one of the most revealing. A reminder that even at the furthest edge of his conquests, thousands of miles from Aristotle's quiet groves at Mieza, the restless, questioning mind his old tutor had first cultivated in him, as a boy had never entirely stopped asking the largest questions available. The edge of India, however, was not, in Alexander's own mind, the edge of the world. Encouraged by rumours and half-understood accounts from local guides, Alexander had come to believe that the great Ganges River, somewhere further east, marked the boundary of the inhabited earth, and beyond it lay only the encircling ocean that the Greeks believed surrounded all known land. He intended to reach it. He intended, having already conquered the Persian Empire and pushed further east than any Greek in history, to march his army all the way to what he believed was the literal end of the world, and stand at the shore of the great encircling sea. His army refused to follow him. By the time Alexander's forces reached the banks of the Hyphasis River, they had been marching and fighting almost continuously for 8 years, thousands of miles from home, through mountains, deserts, and monsoon rains, facing an enemy with war elephants that had terrified even hardened veterans. And now facing rumors, likely exaggerated, but genuinely believed, of even larger kingdoms and even more elephants waiting further east. The men were exhausted in a way that went beyond simple physical fatigue. They were exhausted in their souls, homesick for a Macedon and a Greece most of them had not seen in nearly a decade, and increasingly unable to see any end to their king's ambition. They stopped. It was not, by most ancient accounts, an act of open mutiny or violent rebellion. It was something quieter, and in some ways more devastating for a king who had never once faced open defiance from his own soldiers in 8 years of campaigning. They simply would not move forward. Alexander pleaded with them, reminded them of the glory they had already won together, argued that the encircling ocean, the true end of the world, was surely close at hand. He retreated to his tent for 3 days, sulking, hoping the army's resolve would break before his own did. It did not. For perhaps the first time in his entire life, Alexander was forced to accept a limit he had not chosen for himself. He agreed, finally, to turn back. The mutiny at the Hyphasis deserves to be understood not simply as a strategic setback, but as one of the most emotionally revealing episodes of Alexander's entire life. A moment where the carefully constructed relationship between a king who believed himself touched by the divine and an army of ordinary, mortal, exhausted men finally, openly, cracked by the time the army reached the river. The physical toll of the campaign had become impossible to ignore. Ancient accounts describe soldiers whose armor had rusted through years of monsoon rain, whose sandals had long since worn away on mountain paths never meant for marching feet, whose bodies carried the accumulated scars of a decade of wounds that had never fully had the chance to heal before the next campaign began. Many of these men had left Macedon as very young soldiers, some barely older than boys, and were now approaching middle age, having spent essentially the whole of their adult lives on the march, further from home with each passing year, increasingly uncertain whether they would ever see Macedon or their families or anything resembling an ordinary life again. When Alexander gathered his officers to announce his intention to press on toward the Ganges, the silence that reportedly followed was, by ancient accounts, more unsettling to him than any battlefield reversal had ever been. No one spoke. Finally, a respected senior officer named Granicus, a man who had fought beside Alexander since the earliest campaigns, who had commanded troops with distinction at Gaugamela and the Hydaspes, and whose loyalty could not be dismissed as cowardice or disloyalty, rose and spoke for the army as a whole. His words, as later writers reconstructed them, were respectful but unmistakably firm. The men had followed Alexander through more hardship and further distance than any Macedonian army had ever endured. They had given him everything a soldier could give a king, and they were asking now simply to be allowed to see their homes and their families again before they died in some unknown land even further from everything they had ever known. Alexander's response, retreating to his tent for 3 full days, refusing to see anyone, hoping the army's resolve would crack before his own, reveals a man genuinely unable, even now, to process the idea that his own soldiers, the same men whose loyalty had carried him across 3 continents, might have limits he could not simply overcome through sheer force of will or personal charisma. It was, in its way, the most human moment of his entire adult life, stripped, for 3 days, of every victory and every conquest. Simply a man in a tent, confronted for the first time with a wall he could not break through no matter how he threw himself against it. When he finally emerged and agreed to turn back, the relief that swept through the army was reportedly overwhelming. Soldiers weeping, cheering, embracing one another with a depth of emotion that ancient writers describe as more intense than the celebrations following even his greatest battlefield victories. It is a detail worth sitting with quietly, that the moment his own men loved him most completely, in this telling, was not a moment of conquest at all, but the single moment in 13 years of relentless expansion when Alexander finally, however reluctantly, chose them over the horizon. He would not make that same choice again. Within a year of the reconciliation at Opis that followed the army's later, harsher mutiny, Alexander was already planning new campaigns, new horizons, new unconquered territory to draw his restless attention forward. The hyphasis had taught him that his army possessed a limit. It never seemed to teach him that he possessed one too. Before leaving the banks of the hyphasis, Alexander ordered 12 massive altars built, dedicated to the 12 Olympian gods, marking the farthest eastern extent of his campaign. A monument, perhaps, less to the gods themselves than to the boundary of ambition itself. A physical marker of exactly how far one man had managed to push the edges of the known world before finally, reluctantly, being told no. The journey home was, in its own way, as dangerous and as costly as any battle he had fought. Rather than retracing the route he had already conquered, Alexander split his forces, sending part of the army and a fleet down the Indus River to the sea under the command of his admiral Granicus, while he personally led another portion of the army west across the Gadrosian Desert. A brutal, waterless stretch of terrain in what is now southern Pakistan and Iran, chosen, according to some ancient accounts, partly because Alexander wished to succeed where a legendary Persian queen and even the god Dionysus, according to local legend, had reportedly failed to bring an army through alive. Granicus's fleet, meanwhile, faced its own extraordinary ordeal, sailing along an unfamiliar and largely uncharted coastline, battling monsoon currents, unpredictable tides, and, according to Granicus's own later account, close and unsettling encounters with what were almost certainly whales, enormous creatures breaching near the ships that terrified crews who had never seen anything like them and had no framework for understanding what they were looking at. Until Granicus, by his own report, ordered the fleet to advance directly toward the animals with trumpets sounding and oars beating the water, driving the creatures off and steadying his frightened sailors. It was meant, in part, as a genuine voyage of exploration as much as a supply mission, mapping a coastline no Greek had ever charted, gathering knowledge that Alexander, ever his old tutor's student even after everything, clearly still valued as much as he valued gold or territory. The Gadrosian crossing very nearly destroyed the army that 8 years of warfare had failed to break. Heat, thirst, sandstorms, and flash floods that swept through desert wadis at night claimed enormous numbers of lives, soldiers, camp followers, pack animals, and the accumulated wealth and supplies of years of campaigning, all lost to a desert that cared nothing for the man who had conquered an empire. Historians believe the losses during this single crossing may have exceeded the combined casualties of every battle Alexander had fought against Persian and Indian armies over the previous decade. It remains, among all the extraordinary decisions of his career, one of the most difficult to fully understand or forgive, a punishing detour through hostile terrain that cost thousands of lives for reasons that seem to have been, at least in part, about personal legacy and rivalry with legends of the distant past. Alexander himself, by every ancient account, shared the hardships of the crossing rather than sparing himself. There is a famous story, almost certainly at least partly legendary, but deeply revealing of how his soldiers had come to see him even after everything, that during the worst of the desert crossing, when his men found a small amount of water and brought it to him in a helmet, Alexander, in front of the entire suffering army, poured it out onto the sand rather than drink while his men went thirsty. Whatever the literal truth of the moment, it is the kind of story an army tells about a leader they still, despite everything, believed in. Those who survived the Gadrosian desert eventually reunited with the rest of the army in the Persian heartland, and Alexander, now approaching 30, turned his attention to the enormous task of consolidating and governing the vast empire he had spent nearly a decade conquering. It was in this final phase of his life that Alexander undertook one of his most ambitious and most controversial projects, an attempt to genuinely fuse Macedonian and Persian society into a single, unified ruling elite, rather than simply governing Persia as occupied territory. At the city of Susa, in the spring of 324 BC, he organized a mass wedding ceremony, marrying dozens of his senior officers to Persian noblewomen in a single elaborate ceremony conducted according to Persian custom. And Alexander himself, already married to Roxana, took 2 additional wives from Persian royal lineage, including a daughter of Darius III, a marriage that positioned him, symbolically and genealogically, as the true successor to the very throne he had conquered. The mass wedding at Susa was staged with a theatrical grandeur that ancient writers struggled to fully capture in words. A vast pavilion was constructed for the occasion, its columns draped in costly fabric, its interior arranged with couches for 100 guests at a time, gold and silver vessels set before each place. The whole affair stretched across 5 days of feasting, entertainment, and ceremony conducted according to Persian custom rather than Greek, a deliberate symbolic choice, historians believe, meant to signal that this fusion of Macedonian and Persian nobility was not a Greek institution merely tolerating Persian participants, but something genuinely new, blending both traditions on something closer to equal footing. Each of the 90 or so Macedonian officers who took Persian brides that week received, according to ancient accounts, a dowry from Alexander himself, along with lavish gifts befitting the occasion, a gesture of royal generosity certainly, but also a calculated investment, binding these newly formed families financially and symbolically to Alexander's continued goodwill. Alexander's own marriages during this same ceremony to Darius's daughter Statira and to another Persian princess carried the heaviest symbolic weight of all, positioning him, in the eyes of Persian nobility watching the ceremony unfold, not merely as a foreign conqueror who happened to control their territory, but as a legitimate member of the royal bloodline he had otherwise displaced by. Force. It is worth noting, with the kind of honesty Alexander's own no-nonsense companions might have appreciated, that the grand vision behind the Susa weddings did not survive contact with reality for very long. Many of the Macedonian officers who married Persian brides that week, according to later sources, quietly set the arrangements aside within a few years of Alexander's death. Once the political pressure that had created the unions in the first place no longer existed to enforce them, it was, like so much of Alexander's most ambitious late-life vision for a fused Macedonian-Persian ruling class, a project built with real sincerity and real ceremony, that nonetheless required more time and more of Alexander's own personal presence and authority to sustain than history ultimately allowed him. Many of his Macedonian officers, according to ancient accounts, went through with these marriages out of loyalty and obligation rather than genuine enthusiasm, and most of the unions did not survive Alexander's own death by more than a few years, dissolved quietly once the political pressure that had created them no longer existed. It was, like so much of Alexander's later vision, a project of extraordinary ambition that outran the willingness of the people around him to fully embrace it. Tensions with his oldest Macedonian veterans came to a final head shortly afterward at the city of Opis, when Alexander announced plans to send home veteran soldiers no longer fit for active campaigning. While continuing to integrate Persian soldiers into the core of his army. His Macedonian troops, already resentful of years of what they saw as growing favoritism toward Persian customs and Persian soldiers, erupted into open mutiny, shouting that Alexander should simply campaign with his Persian troops and his godfather Ammon, and leave the Macedonians who had actually built his empire to go home without him. Alexander, in a fury, had the ringleaders of the protest arrested and executed on the spot. And then, in a gesture that reveals the genuine emotional bond beneath the anger on both sides, he addressed the entire assembled army directly, reminding them of everything they had achieved together, everything his father and he had built for them, and then withdrew, in apparent grief, refusing to see any Macedonian officers for 2 days. The army broke first. Soldiers gathered outside his tent, begging forgiveness, weeping, until Alexander finally emerged, tears in his own eyes. And the reconciliation that followed was, by ancient accounts, a moment of genuine and overwhelming emotion on both sides. A king and an army who had marched together to the edge of the known world, finally, exhaustedly, making peace with what they had built together and what it had cost each of them. It would prove to be one of the last great moments of unity Alexander would ever share with the men who had followed him from Macedon. In the autumn of 324 BC, in the city of Ecbatana, Alexander's closest friend since childhood, Hephaestion, the same companion who had run beside him around the tomb of Patroclus at Troy years earlier, the man many ancient sources describe, with varying degrees of directness, as the great love of Alexander's life, fell suddenly and severely ill, likely from typhoid fever, and died within days. Alexander's grief was, by every ancient account, total and consuming. He is said to have thrown himself on Hephaestion's body and refused to leave it for a full day and night. He ordered the manes and tails of all horses and mules in the army shorn in mourning, in the old Homeric tradition of grief for a fallen companion. He had the physician who had treated Hephaestion executed, or possibly crucified, for failing to save him. He sent to the oracle at Siwa, the same oracle he himself had once consulted about his own divinity, to ask whether Hephaestion could be honoured as a god, and was told, more modestly, that he could be honoured as a divine hero. Alexander ordered a funeral of almost unimaginable extravagance and, according to some accounts, briefly banned all music and celebration throughout the empire in mourning. The scale of mourning Alexander ordered for Hephaestion went well beyond even the considerable extravagance ancient royal grief typically allowed. Accounts describe a funeral pyre constructed in Babylon on a scale that dwarfed anything the city had seen before, rising in tiers, said to stand well over 100 feet high, covered in gold and elaborate sculptural decoration, consuming, by some ancient estimates, a sum of money that would have funded a substantial military campaign in its own right. Alexander is said to have personally overseen every detail of the preparations, unwilling to delegate even the smallest decision regarding the ceremony to anyone else, as though the act of controlling every visible aspect of his friend's memorial might offer some small measure of control over a loss that otherwise refused to be managed or contained. He sent messengers throughout the empire ordering that Hephaestion be honoured as a divine hero in shrines and temples across his territories, an unprecedented posthumous elevation for a man who had held no royal blood of his own, achieving in death a kind of formal, religiously sanctioned status that few mortals in the ancient world ever received. Soldiers who had known Hephaestion only as one senior officer among several were required to observe mourning rituals more commonly reserved for the death of a king. It was, by any reasonable measure, a grief that had stopped observing the ordinary boundaries between personal loss and public spectacle, the same totality of feeling redirected now toward mourning, that Alexander had once brought to conquest itself, as though he did not know how to feel anything by half measures. Something in Alexander seemed to break, quietly and permanently, in the months after Hephaestion's death. He grew, by several ancient accounts, more erratic, more prone to sudden and extravagant grief, more consumed by omens and religious ritual than he had been even in his most superstitious younger years. He began planning new campaigns. An invasion of Arabia was reportedly in active preparation, as though motion itself, the endless forward momentum that had defined his entire adult life, was the only thing that had ever kept the deeper questions of loss and mortality at bay. He did not live to begin it. In late May or early June of 323 BC, in Babylon, the same magnificent city that had once welcomed him with garlands and incense as a conquering liberator, Alexander attended a lengthy banquet and, in the days that followed, developed a fever that did not break. Ancient sources describe a slow, agonizing decline over roughly 10 to 12 days, fever, increasing weakness, eventually the loss of his ability to speak. His generals and officers, growing desperate, are said to have filed past his deathbed one by one, and when they asked him, in his final failing hours, to whom he left his vast empire, Alexander is said to have whispered a single word that has echoed through history ever since, endlessly debated for its meaning, Critisto to the strongest. Historians have argued for centuries over what actually killed him: malaria, typhoid fever, an infection following the drinking bouts he had increasingly indulged in during his final years even. In the more sensational theories that surface periodically, poison administered by rivals fearful of his growing instability and ambition. No definitive medical diagnosis has ever been agreed upon, and likely never will be, the evidence too fragmentary and too filtered through ancient writers, more interested in drama than clinical precision. What is certain is this: Alexander III of Macedon, who had never lost a single battle in his life, who had conquered the greatest empire the world had ever known, who had marched further east than any Greek before or since, died in Babylon at the age of 32, having ruled as king for just under 13 years, leaving behind no clear successor, no settled plan for who should govern the vast territories he had won, and a wife, Roxana, pregnant with a son who would be born only after his father was already gone. In the quiet weeks after Hephaestion's funeral, as Babylon settled into an uneasy, watchful calm, and rumours of the coming Arabian campaign spread through the barracks, veterans who had marched with Alexander since the crossing of the Hellespont more than a decade earlier found themselves increasingly exchanging a particular kind of look across the campfire. The look of men who have followed someone further than they ever intended to go, and who no longer fully recognize the person leading them, even as their loyalty. Worn smooth and unquestioning by more than a decade of shared hardship, remains largely intact. Some of these men had left Macedon as teenagers, full of the same restless hunger for glory that had defined their young king. They were, by now, men in their 30s and 40s, grey at the temples, scarred from a dozen battles and 100 smaller skirmishes, many of them with wives and children scattered across garrison towns from Asia Minor to the Indus Valley, an empire's worth of half Macedonian, half Persian, half Bactrian, half Sogdian families who existed, in a sense, only because one man's ambition had once decided the world was not large enough to leave unconquered. What would become of all of them now that the campaigns finally seemed, however briefly, to be slowing? What would become of an empire built so completely around the personality and presence of a single king? A king who had just spent weeks in a grief so total that he had ordered a friend's physician executed and briefly banned music across an empire that stretched over 2 continents. These were the quiet, unspoken questions moving through the Macedonian camp at Babylon in the early summer of 323 BC. questions that would receive their answer, in the most abrupt and devastating way possible, within a matter of days. News of Alexander's death travelled outward from Babylon the way news of his victories once had, swiftly, and with a kind of disbelief that followed it everywhere it went. It seemed, to a generation that had watched him win every battle he ever fought, cross deserts no army had survived, and pushed the boundaries of the known world further than any Greek had imagined possible. Almost impossible that a man who had defied mortality so completely on so many battlefields could simply die of a fever in his own bed, in the prime of his life, with so much left unfinished. But he was gone, and the empire he left behind, built with such extraordinary speed and held together, in the end, largely by the sheer force of his own personality and reputation, did not survive him for long in any unified form. His generals, men who had fought beside him since the earliest campaigns, men who had crossed the Hydaspes and the Gadrosian desert together, men bound to one another by a decade of shared hardship and shared glory, turned almost immediately on each other. The wars that followed, known to historians as the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors, dragged on for decades as Alexander's former commanders carved his empire into a patchwork of rival kingdoms, each claiming some portion of his legacy, none able to hold the whole of what he had built. While Alexander marched ever further from Macedon, the kingdom he had left behind was not simply waiting patiently for his return. He had entrusted the governance of Macedon and Greece to Antipater, his father's old general, a capable and steady administrator who spent more than a decade managing the difficult, often thankless work of keeping Greece pacified, funding reinforcements for Alexander's campaigns, and containing periodic unrest among Greek cities who had never fully accepted Macedonian dominance, all while navigating an increasingly tense relationship with Olympias, who remained in Macedon as Queen Mother, and who made no secret of her belief that Antipater did not show her the deference she was owed. The correspondence between Antipater and Olympias, according to ancient sources who had access to at least some of these letters, grew bitter enough over the years that Alexander himself was regularly drawn into the dispute from thousands of miles away, receiving complaints from his mother about Antipater's supposed overreach, and countervailing reports from Antipater questioning whether Olympias's involvement in Macedonian governance was becoming genuinely disruptive. Alexander, according to several accounts, grew visibly weary of adjudicating this long-distance family and political feud, reportedly remarking at one point that his mother's single letter of complaint outweighed 10 years of Antipater's loyal service in the immediate emotional impact it carried on him, a wry, exhausted acknowledgement of just how difficult it was, even for the conqueror of the known world, to fully escape the gravitational pull of his own difficult, formidable mother. This distant domestic tension would take on far greater significance in the aftermath of Alexander's death, when the fragile balance of power in Macedon collapsed entirely, and Olympias, no longer restrained by any need to preserve her son's goodwill, moved with ruthless determination against rivals within the royal family, a final, brutal echo of the same court politics that had shaped Alexander's own earliest, most dangerous days as king. Playing out one final time after the son who had once been the balancing force between these rival ambitions was no longer there to manage them. Roxana's son, born after his father's death and briefly recognized as joint king under the name Alexander IV, never ruled in any meaningful sense. He and his mother were eventually murdered years later, casualties of the very wars fought in his name by men who had once served his father. Alexander's own family line, remarkably, did not survive him by more than a decade or two. An empire built by one extraordinary man, unable to sustain even the simple continuity of his own bloodline once he was gone. And yet, in the deeper, stranger sense that ancient history so often teaches us, Alexander's empire did not truly disappear. It simply changed shape. The kingdoms his generals carved out of his conquests, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire stretching across much of the old Persian heartland, the Antigonid kingdom in Macedon, and Greece itself, became, for the next 3 centuries, the great powers of what historians now call the Hellenistic world, a world in which Greek language, Greek art, Greek philosophy, and Greek political forms spread further and more deeply across the Near East and Central Asia than they ever had before Alexander's campaigns began. Greek became the common language of trade and administration from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. Greek theatres, Greek gymnasiums, and Greek-style cities rose in places that had never seen them before, many of them, like Alexandria itself, still bearing Alexander's name. Alexandria in Egypt, the city he had founded almost as an afterthought on his return from the oracle at Siwa, grew under his successors into one of the greatest cities the ancient world had ever known, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, which for centuries gathered and preserved the accumulated knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world, and to scholars, mathematicians, and astronomers whose work would shape science for 2,000 years to come. It remains, to this day, one of the great cities of Egypt, a living monument to a decision made by a young king who paused, briefly, on his way back from a desert pilgrimage to imagine a city into being. The fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures that followed in Alexander's wake, sometimes called Hellenism, reshaped art, religion, and philosophy across an enormous stretch of the ancient world. Greek sculptural styles blended with Persian, Egyptian, and Central Asian traditions in ways that produced entirely new artistic forms. Greek philosophical schools took root as far east as Bactria, in the very mountains where Alexander had once fought his grinding guerrilla campaign against Bessus. Trade routes, opened and secured by his conquests, connected the Mediterranean world to Central Asia and the edges of India in ways that would eventually help lay the groundwork for what later centuries would call the Silk Road. Alexandria in Egypt was, in the end, only the most famous of a whole network of cities Alexander founded or refounded across his empire, many of them strategically placed along trade routes and river crossings, garrison towns that gradually transformed, over the generations that followed, into genuine centers of Greek culture and commerce deep inside territory that had never known a permanent Greek presence before. Alexandria, in Arachosia, near modern Kandahar in Afghanistan, Alexandria Eskati, Alexandria the furthest, founded on the banks of the Jaxartes River at the very edge of the territory his armies ever controlled, intended as a fortified check against nomadic incursions from the steppes beyond. Alexandria on the Oxus. Alexandria in the Caucasus, near modern Kabul, city after city, scattered across a stretch of territory from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, each one carrying, in some form, the name of the king who founded it, each one a small permanent piece of Greek civic life planted in soil that had never grown it before. The cumulative effect of these foundations over the 3 centuries that followed Alexander's death was a genuine and lasting transformation of the ancient world's cultural map. Greek became not merely the language of a small peninsula and its colonies, but a genuine lingua franca of trade and administration stretching from the western Mediterranean to the borders of India, the same linguistic foundation, centuries later, that would allow early Christian texts to spread with such speed across the Roman world. Since the Greek in which the New Testament was originally written was, in no small part, a direct inheritance of the linguistic unity Alexander's conquests had first established. Greek art and architecture blended with Persian, Egyptian, and Central Asian traditions to produce entirely new hybrid styles, visible even today in archaeological sites stretching from Alexandria's ancient harbour to the Buddhist art of Gandhara, in what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, where Greek sculptural techniques, carried east by the descendants of Alexander's soldiers and settlers, eventually shaped how the Buddha himself came to be depicted in human form for the first time, an artistic lineage running, however indirectly, from a sculptor's workshop in classical Greece to Buddhist temples thousands of miles to the east, connected by nothing more than the restless ambition of one Macedonian king and the soldiers who settled the lands he conquered. Trade, too, flowed more freely across this newly connected world than it ever had before. The roads and garrison towns Alexander established, intended originally for military purposes, gradually became the arteries of a genuinely transcontinental commercial network, carrying silk, spices, and ideas between societies that had previously known each other only through second-hand rumour and half-mythical travellers' tales. Historians studying the later development of the Silk Road, the great trade network that would eventually connect China to the Mediterranean world, consistently point back to the infrastructure and cultural connections Alexander's conquests first established as an essential, foundational precondition for everything that followed. None of this, it is worth remembering, was fully intended or foreseen by Alexander himself. He founded these cities, for the most part, as practical military and administrative necessities. Garrison points to secure a rapidly expanding empire, not as a deliberate long-term project of cultural fusion in the way later admirers sometimes prefer to imagine. And yet the consequences of his conquests rippled outward across centuries and continents in ways that even his own restless imagination, reaching always for the next horizon, the next unconquered kingdom, could scarcely have anticipated, a reminder that history's largest transformations are rarely the product of any single person's full understanding of what they are setting in motion. Alexander himself became, almost immediately after his death, something closer to legend than history, a process his own life, with its oracles and its Homeric self-fashioning and its careful cultivation of divine associations, had arguably already begun while he was still alive. Ancient historians, writing decades and even centuries after his death, struggled to separate the man from the myth that had already grown up around him, even in his own lifetime. Some portrayed him as history's greatest hero, a civilizing force who spread Greek culture and learning to the ends of the earth. Others, particularly in the centuries closer to his own life, portrayed him with real ambivalence. A brilliant general and a visionary, yes, but also a man whose later years revealed genuine cruelty, paranoia, and a dangerous, growing conviction in his own divinity that had cost the lives of loyal friends like Clytus and respected officers like Parmenion and Philotas. Historians remain genuinely divided, even now, on how best to understand a life of this scale and this contradiction. One school of thought, echoing a much older tradition of history writing, treats Alexander as history's clearest example of the individual genius as a force capable of reshaping the entire world through sheer personal will, a great man whose particular combination of tactical brilliance, restless ambition, and personal courage genuinely altered the course of human civilization in ways no other single figure of the ancient world managed to match. Another, more skeptical school points instead to the extraordinary military and administrative machine Philip II had already built before his son ever crossed into Asia, arguing that Alexander's conquests, remarkable as they were, became possible largely because he inherited an army, a treasury, and a set of tactical innovations that few other rulers of his generation could have matched, regardless of their personal talent, that the moment, in other words, made the man nearly as much as the man made the moment. The honest answer, as with so much about him, likely sits somewhere between these two extremes, refusing the tidiness either interpretation would prefer. Philip built an extraordinary weapon, but weapons alone do not conquer the largest empire the ancient world had ever known. marching further than any Greek army before or since, winning every single battle across 13 years against enemies of wildly varying strength, terrain, and tactics. Something in Alexander himself, the restless curiosity Aristotle had cultivated, the audacious, sometimes reckless personal courage, first visible on a riverbank at the Granicus, the genuine gift for inspiring loyalty, even in men who had every practical reason to eventually abandon him, mattered enormously too, in ways no inherited army or treasury could fully account for on its own. Perhaps both portraits are true at once, which is, in the end, the most honest way to understand him. Alexander was not a simple man, and his was not a simple story. He was a student of Aristotle who ordered cities burned to the ground, a king who wept over the body of a friend he himself had killed in a drunken rage, and who also, in the very same years, showed genuine, sustained generosity toward the family of the enemy he had dethroned. A conqueror who spread Greek learning and Greek cities across half the known world, and who also, in his relentless pursuit of glory, marched thousands of soldiers to their deaths in a desert crossing that accomplished nothing beyond proving a point to legends of the distant past. He contained, within a single short life, both the very best and the very worst of what unlimited human ambition can produce. For more than 2,000 years since his death, Alexander has remained one of history's most studied and most imitated figures. Julius Caesar, according to ancient tradition, wept before a statue of Alexander in Spain, lamenting that by the age Alexander had already conquered the known world. Caesar himself had accomplished comparatively little. Roman generals for centuries afterward measured their own ambitions against his example. Medieval and Renaissance rulers across Europe, the Islamic world, and beyond told and retold his story. In the Quran and Islamic tradition, he appears, in some interpretations, as the figure known as Dul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a righteous conqueror who travelled to the ends of the earth. Napoleon Bonaparte reportedly carried accounts of Alexander's campaigns with him as he planned his own conquests. Military academies still study his tactics at Gaugamela and the Hydaspes as masterclasses in battlefield innovation, more than 2,000 years after he first devised them on the fly, facing enemies who outnumbered him by staggering margins. It is worth pausing, too, on how strange and how fragile the historical record of Alexander's life actually is, given how enormous his legend eventually became. Not a single account of his campaigns written by someone who actually marched alongside him has survived to the present day in its original form. Ptolemy's memoir, written decades after Alexander's death by a man who had every reason to shape the story in ways flattering to himself and to the dynasty he founded in Egypt, survives only through the writings of much later historians who used it as a source. The same is true of accounts by Granicus, describing his extraordinary coastal voyage, and by Aristobulus, an engineer who accompanied the campaign. What we actually possess, the detailed narratives historians rely upon today, written by authors like Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus, and Curtius, were composed centuries after Alexander's death, drawing on these lost earlier sources filtered, inevitably, through the particular biases, literary ambitions, and moral preoccupations of writers working in entirely different eras, for entirely different audiences, some of them more interested in providing moral lessons about the dangers of unchecked power than in providing precise historical fact. This is why so much of Alexander's story, even the details recounted with apparent confidence in the more dramatic tellings, comes wrapped, on close examination, in some version of the phrase historians believe, or according to ancient sources, or several accounts suggest. It is not that these events did not happen. It is that we are reconstructing the life of a man who died more than 2,000 years ago from a handful of surviving texts, themselves copies of copies of copies, written by authors who never met him, drawing on earlier accounts we no longer possess. Composed by men who did know him, but who each carried their own reasons: flattery, rivalry, moral instruction, sheer literary drama, for shaping the story a particular way. Modern archaeology has, in recent decades, added real texture to this fragmentary picture, even where it cannot resolve every ancient dispute. Excavations at sites across the former Persian Empire have confirmed the extraordinary wealth of cities like Bucephalus and Susa that ancient writers described. The foundations of several cities Alexander is credited with founding have been identified and studied, including sites in modern Afghanistan and Tajikistan that confirm just how far into Central Asia his network of garrison towns genuinely extended. Coins minted during and after his reign, many bearing his image with the ram's horns of Zeus Ammon curling from his temples, a visual reference. Unmistakable to anyone in the ancient world, to the divine parentage the oracle at Siwa was believed to have confirmed, offer a rare form of evidence not filtered through any later historian's pen. A piece of Alexander's own self-presentation, minted and circulated within his own lifetime and the years immediately following it. And still, across all those centuries of imitation and admiration, the deeper question at the heart of his story remains genuinely, permanently unresolved. Was Alexander driven by a visionary desire to unite East and West into something greater than either had been alone? The mass weddings at Susa, the deliberate fusion of Persian and Macedonian administration, the founding of Greek cities across a dozen conquered territories, all evidence of a genuine, if flawed, dream of a unified world? Or was all of it, in the end, simply the byproduct of a restless, unfillable hunger for glory that could never be satisfied by any single victory, any single kingdom, any single continent? A hunger that drove him from the banks of the Danube to the banks of the Hyphasis, and would very likely have driven him on toward Arabia and beyond, had a fever in Babylon not finally stopped him where 8 years of unbroken victory never could. The ancient Greeks had a word for the particular quality that seemed to drive Alexander forward through every stage of his life. A word that appears again and again in the accounts written about him. Pothos. A yearning, a longing for something just out of reach, a desire not quite reducible to ordinary ambition or greed. Ancient writers use it specifically to describe the pull that sent him to the oracle at Siwa, deep in the Libyan desert, far from any military necessity. They use it to describe his insistence on reaching the edge of India, on seeing the encircling ocean the Greeks believed marked the boundary of the inhabited world. They use it, in some tellings, even to describe the restless energy that first sent him across the Hellespont in the first place, before Persia's wealth or Persia's threat to Greece had fully justified, in any purely practical sense, the scale of the war he intended to wage. Pothos is a difficult word to translate cleanly into modern language, and perhaps that difficulty is itself instructive. It is not simply ambition, which implies a clear goal pursued for clear reasons. It is not simply curiosity, though curiosity was certainly part of it, the same curiosity Aristotle had cultivated in him at Mieza. The specimens he sent home from Asia, the geographic questions he seemed genuinely eager to answer with his own eyes rather than second-hand report. It is closer, perhaps, to a kind of perpetual dissatisfaction with the boundary of the known. A conviction, seemingly bone-deep in him from childhood, that whatever he had already achieved could never quite be enough, that there was always some further horizon that mattered more than the one he currently stood upon. Perhaps this is the truest answer available to the question every biographer of Alexander eventually has to sit with. Why did he never stop? Why, having already achieved more than any conqueror in the history of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, having already secured wealth and territory and glory beyond what any single lifetime could reasonably need, did he continue pushing forward into deserts that nearly destroyed his army, into mountain warfare that cost him 3 grinding years against an enemy who refused to fight him? Fairly, into a war his own soldiers eventually had to refuse to continue before he would finally, reluctantly, turn back? The Pothos does not fully explain it. But it names, at least, the shape of the hunger, a hunger that no victory, however total, seemed able to satisfy for very long, and that would, in the final calculation, prove to be both the engine of everything he accomplished and, quite possibly, the thing that never let him rest long enough to fully enjoy any of it. Perhaps the honest answer is that Alexander himself could not have fully separated the two. The boy who tamed Bucephalus by understanding what frightened it, who wept when his father told him Macedon would be too small a kingdom for him, who kept the Iliad beneath his pillow and measured his own life against the brief, glorious span of Achilles, had been taught from his very earliest years that glory and greatness were not simply things a man might achieve, but things a man was obligated to pursue, whatever the cost, for as long as breath remained in his body. He achieved more of it, by any measure history has ever used, than almost any human being who has ever lived. And it consumed him, in the end, just as completely as it elevated him, a king who died at 32, farther from home than any Macedonian had ever travelled, having left behind an empire too vast for any one man to hold, a name that would outlive every empire built upon it. And a question that historians, generals, and quiet listeners like you have been turning over gently in the dark for more than 2,000 years since. There is a final, quieter irony worth sitting with as this story draws toward its close. One that Alexander himself, so attentive throughout his life to the shape of his own legend, would very likely have appreciated. The empire he built stretched at its absolute height across roughly 2 million square miles from the Adriatic coast to the mountains bordering India, a territory larger than almost any single political entity the world had yet seen. And yet it held together in any unified form for barely a decade beyond his own death, fracturing almost immediately into the rival kingdoms of his squabbling generals. The empire, in other words, proved almost entirely inseparable from the singular, restless will of the one man who had built it. A structure so thoroughly organized around Alexander's own personal authority, his own particular genius for inspiring loyalty and terror in equal measure, that it simply could not survive his absence, however carefully his administrators had managed the day-to-day business of governing in his name. And yet the man himself, the actual historical figure who tamed a frightened horse and wept over a murdered friend and marched an exhausted army through a desert that very nearly swallowed it whole, has survived in the world's memory for more than 2,000 years, far longer and far more vividly than the empire he spent his entire adult life building ever managed to endure. It is a strange, almost paradoxical inheritance for a man who seemed throughout his life so genuinely obsessed with the physical scale of what he could conquer and control, that in the end it was not the borders of his empire that outlasted him, borders that dissolved within a generation into a patchwork of rival Hellenistic kingdoms, but something far less tangible, a story retold and reshaped across 2,000 years of Roman generals and medieval chroniclers and Renaissance painters and modern historians, still capable, even now, of holding the attention of someone lying quietly in the dark, listening to the sound of a voice describing a boy who once tamed a horse no other man could ride. There is one final piece of Alexander's story worth sitting with, quietly, before we let it go for the night. Not a battle, not a betrayal, but a simple physical fact that historians and archaeologists have never fully resolved. Alexander's own body, embalmed after his death in Babylon, and originally intended for burial in the royal tombs of Macedon alongside his father, was instead diverted, in the political chaos that followed his death, to Egypt by his former general Ptolemy, who understood, with the same shrewd instinct that had made him one of Alexander's most trusted companions, that possessing the body of the god-king would carry enormous symbolic and political weight for whoever held it. Alexander was eventually laid to rest in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria itself, the city he had founded on his way back from the desert oracle at Siwa, where it became, for centuries, one of the most famous pilgrimage sites in the ancient Mediterranean world. Roman emperors, centuries later, are recorded visiting the tomb to pay their respects, Augustus among them, reportedly so overcome with reverence that he refused to view the tombs of the Ptolemaic rulers who had succeeded Alexander in Egypt, saying he had come to see a king, not a row of corpses. And then, at some point in the chaos of Alexandria's later history, the exact circumstances lost to time, swallowed by riots, by fires, by the slow accumulated erosion of 2,000 years, the tomb itself simply disappeared. Despite centuries of searching, despite countless archaeological expeditions, and no shortage of confident claims over the years, the final resting place of one of history's most famous and most consequential human beings has never been definitively rediscovered. Somewhere beneath the modern city of Alexandria, perhaps, or lost entirely to earthquakes and rising seas that have swallowed other parts of the ancient harbour, lies the body of a king whose name is known to nearly every person on earth in a grave that no living person can find. And so we come to the end of Alexander's story, a life that burned so fast and so bright that it reshaped the map of the ancient world in barely 13 years, and then was gone, leaving behind an empire no one else could hold, and a legend no one has ever quite managed to put down. Power, it seems, was never really the destination for him, it was the hunger itself. The thing that carried him from a training ground in Macedon to the banks of a river in India, always certain that just beyond the next mountain, the next river, the next army, there was something greater still waiting to be claimed. And there is perhaps a reason a story like this one belongs here, at the end of a long day, in the quiet dark. Alexander's life was, in almost every sense, the opposite of rest, an existence defined by motion, by the refusal to ever quite arrive, by a mind that seemed constitutionally incapable of sitting still with what it had already achieved. He conquered an empire and could not enjoy it. He won every battle and never once, by any surviving account, seemed to feel that winning was enough. Perhaps, listening to his story now, in the stillness of your own room, there is something quietly valuable in simply noticing the contrast, in letting yourself do the one thing his entire extraordinary, exhausting life never seemed to allow him to do. Rest, just for tonight. Rest, thank you, for spending this night with me here on Grand Age Power. If his story moved you, a like helps other sleepy souls find us. And tell me, gently, in the comments, do you think Alexander's restless hunger for more was his greatest gift to history, or his most tragic flaw? Subscribe. We have so many more powerful stories waiting for quiet nights just like this one. Let the weight of the day rest now. Let his story settle over you like a blanket, warm and heavy, carrying you gently towards sleep. Whatever tomorrow holds, it can wait until morning. Sleep well, dear soul. And may Alexander's extraordinary story, every victory, every grief, every impossible mile, stay gently with you in your dreams. Until next time, good night from Grand Age Power.